true ghost story, The Haunted Farmhouse. Story by Tony Capobianco. Welcome to the Haunted Half Moon Inn. This old colonial farmhouse was built in the late 1700s. Over the past few centuries, many different people have lived and died there, and it seems that some of them have never left. It's a place, the gravity of which is so strong, where not even death is strong enough to separate the occupant's spirits from the house. It is an ominous place, where one may be dead and yet live. At this crossroads between the physical and spiritual realms, nightmares manifest into reality. The old farmhouse located in New York's Hudson Valley is and has been occupied by a sinister presence. Some believe that the presence is that of evil, inhuman spirits that never walked the earth in human form. The chilling experiences of those who lived within its aged walls are pure nightmare fuel. As extraordinary and hard to believe as the stories about the Half Moon Inn may seem, they are true. A truly remarkable aspect about the haunting of the old farmhouse separates it from many other purportedly haunted houses and places. The noteworthy aspect is the unusually high number of paranormal phenomena experienced by a significant number of individuals. In many ghost stories, the unexplained phenomena are often experienced by one or two people in the family that's living in a ghostly place. In other famous accounts, such as the Amityville haunting, only one family reported having paranormal activity in the house. My dad's old haunted farmhouse, once known as the Half Moon Inn, is a more rare case. Not only did my dad and most of his immediate family experience the haunting, but so too did his extended family and friends. Not only that, but to my knowledge, every family that has lived in that malevolent house after my dad moved out has experienced terrifying spirit activity as well. The many people who experienced and suffered paranormal activity there can verify the veracity of these accounts. Out of respect for the privacy of the current owners of the old farmhouse, the name of the town has been changed. However, the following events, though perhaps seemingly inexplicable, are 100% true. The old farmhouse was my dad's home for several years in the 1960s. Along with his two brothers, his mother, and his father, my dad moved from Queens, New York to Junction Ridge, New York. They left the hustle and bustle of New York City for the greener pastures of upstate New York. The colonial-style farmhouse was supposed to be their dream home. They traded in the congested city life for the wide open spaces of the charming Hudson Valley. Rather than being confined to their front stoops in a concrete jungle, they found themselves free to explore and cultivate many acres of land. The property, filled with grass fields and trees, was beautiful. The house, though old, was spacious. It was considerably larger than their previous house in Queens. As liberating as country life was, it came with new great responsibilities. The property was a farm, and my dad and his brothers had to quickly learn to become farmers. My dad was around 11 or 12 years old at the time. While it may sound insane by today's cultural standards, my grandfather, who ran a trucking business in the city, put his three sons in charge of operating the farm. My father was the middle child. His elder brother was around 16 years old. The three city boys were responsible for cutting hay, feeding chickens, cows, and horses, and milking the cows. The needs of the animals and the farm meant that the boys, in addition to going to school, had to wake up before the sun rose each day. Whether they were afraid of the paranormal and preternatural activity or not, the cows had to be milked, and all the other animals needed to be fed. A cow that isn't milked experiences pain, and they'll moo to let you know it. The strange incidents started out small at first. Both my dad and my uncle attested to these facts. Family members would put down a set of keys, looked away, and then looked back again, only to find that the keys had vanished. They'd look around to see if they had accidentally knocked them onto the floor, but there would be no trace of them. The keys would then mysteriously show up a few hours or days later in the most unexpected places. Keys weren't the only small objects that would be moved around. Ultimately, these objects would often turn up on the opposite side of the house in strange places that they didn't normally check, like on the top of a cabinet, high out of reach. The kinds of places where the lost objects were discovered were often places that took effort to get to. They weren't the kind of places that you would absent-mindedly misplace something. At first, my dad thought that the misplaced objects seemed strange and curious, but that the incidences could have been the product of forgetfulness or trick of the mind. It didn't seem like a big deal, and besides that, he was too busy going to school and farming to dwell on the seemingly trivial subject. Over time, however, small things such as moved objects, feeling a cold chill, and hearing toilets flush when no one was in the bathroom, transformed to bigger, more frightful levels. My dad, his brother, and their mother heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone walking around upstairs. They would go upstairs to check it out, and they'd find that no one was there. Footsteps walking up and down the stairs became a nearly daily occurrence. They would hear the phantom footsteps when they were downstairs, as well as when they tried to rest in their beds upstairs at night. It became common to hear the inexplicable sound of footsteps walking to the bathroom, and then hear the toilet flush. Sometimes this would happen when my dad was all alone in the house. Other times, this activity would occur when the family was together in one room. Like much of the scary paranormal activity, it didn't matter if you were alone or not. Either way, it continued to happen with an unnerving regularity. It didn't take long for the paranormal activity to increase to terrifying levels. They saw full-bodied apparitions, heard disembodied evil voices, and at times there were physical assaults. Things got so bad that the family of 5 eventually slept together in the same room. They were too afraid to be alone in that house. In the future, if you're interested, I'd like to elaborate on the escalating horror that my dad experienced in that haunted house. Until then, I'd like to share my ghostly experience at that house with you first. A most peculiar observation about the old farmhouse is that, in all of the decades since my dad and his family moved out of that house, the various owners seemed to have quarantined themselves to a tiny part of the house. The small part of the house where the owners chose to live was an addition to the original colonial-era house. Facing the house from the road, the new addition was on the left side. Some years after my grandfather sold that house, he stopped by to check on the family that he had sold the house to. He had been curious as to whether or not they had experienced anything strange there over the years that they had lived there. The lady that owned that house told my grandpa that the house was haunted and that her daughter had been assaulted by a spirit. The lady explained that the haunting was so severe that she struck a deal of sorts with the evil spirits. She built the new addition to the house so that the menacing ghosts might leave her alone. This was the reason that the addition operated as a self-contained apartment. It included a new but small kitchen, living area, bathroom, and bedroom. The addition was purposely built to keep it separate from the original house. Several different families have bought and moved into that infernal house over the years, and every family has chosen to live in the addition rather than in the big, spacious, historical house. The reason that we believe that all of the different families have kept the tradition of living in the small addition is based off of what we have seen. Over the years, since my family lived close by in a neighboring town, we'd periodically drive by to look at my dad's infamous former house. Over the decades, without fail, there were never any lights on in the old, original house. There wasn't a light on for reading, no lights on upstairs or downstairs, and no flickering lights from a TV could be seen. Instead, the only lights came from the newer added-on part of the house. By the light of day, we could see that the original part of the house fell deeper and deeper into disrepair. The white, two-story colonial farmhouse was aged and the paint became ever more chipped each year. It was surreal to behold how the biggest part of the house, the original structure, looked to be abandoned while seeing that the smaller addition was maintained well. It looked every bit as haunted as my family said that it was. Till this very day, just thinking about that old farmhouse gives me the chills. One unforgettable day in the autumn of 1996, I visited the haunted old farmhouse. Before a varsity football game, my best friend Matt sat in the passenger seat in my family's white Jeep Cherokee as I drove to go on an adventure. We had an hour or so to kill before we had to get into the locker room to suit up for the game. Since I was picking him up to head over to the high school and he lived in Junction Ridge, I decided that we'd drive by my dad's old house. It was only a couple of miles away from Matt's house. Having heard my dad tell his stories about that place, Matt was excited to go see it in person. I drove slowly as we drew near the old farmhouse. When we had arrived, I parked the car on the side of the road and shut off the engine. It was daylight, and we didn't expect to see or experience anything. It was just supposed to be a quick adventure. We sat in the Jeep for a few minutes as we watched the house. Suddenly, a cold chill ran through my bones as the atmosphere abruptly changed. I looked nervously at Matt and asked, "Hey, do you feel that?" "The very thick, heavy, and oppressive air? Yeah, man, I feel it," anxiously replied Matt. It's as if he had read my mind. The air was similar to the thickness of a day with 100% humidity, except instead of moisture filling the atmosphere, every negative human feeling had taken the water's place. It's difficult to accurately convey the experience. It felt unnatural. I'd have to say that the suffocating atmosphere is best described as unadulterated evil. Perhaps this was but a foretaste of what damned souls experience for an eternity in hell. Somehow I just knew that we were in the presence of something inhuman, something evil, something that desires to terrorize and harm us. While I did not see any otherworldly form, every fiber of my being was absolutely certain that we were not alone. All of a sudden, without warning, my engine attempted to turn over. It was the sound that an engine makes when a car won't start on a bitterly cold day. The engine rapidly turned on and off while producing a clicking sound, but the car did not start. Matt and I quickly shot bewildered and frightened looks at each other. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was as though the hairs on my body would have run far away from that place if such a thing were possible. My hands had been nowhere near the keys in the ignition. The hands of Matt, who remained motionless right beside me, never moved an inch. The engine had clearly tried and failed to turn itself on. The engine had sputtered as it attempted to start, and it did so without the aid of any human hand turning the keys in the ignition. Cars don't simply start by themselves. Some invisible force or entity must have begun to start the car. While I'm not certain whether or not keyless ignition or remote car starters existed in 1996, I am quite certain that our car didn't possess those features. My eyes widened as I yelled, "Dude, what the hell was that?" Matt's face tensed up as he replied, "I don't know. Just get the hell out of here!" Shaken, I reached for the keys in the ignition and started the engine. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings as adrenaline coursed through my veins. With a heavy foot, I pressed the gas pedal and raced out of there. While I don't particularly remember the football game that we played in that night, I've never forgotten our ghostly experience from that day. My dad's stories of his time at that old farmhouse are far more terrifying than my own encounter with the evil spirits that reside there. His true scary tales could fill an entire book. I can't imagine what it must have been like for him to live in that haunted farmhouse when he was but a boy. It must have been beyond traumatic. It almost certainly left a lifelong mark on him and his brothers. After living there, they would never see the world the same way again. They would never doubt the existence of spiritual beings or whether or not there is life after death. Unless you've experienced the unseen world yourself, you can't really grasp what it's like. People have had paranormal experiences in that house that are far more frightening than anything that you've seen on TV or in a movie. It was my dad's dreadful experiences with the evil spirits at the old farmhouse, along with my own experiences there, that inspired this YouTube channel. The Haunted Half Moon Inn YouTube channel is named after the sinister house in Junction Ridge, New York. That house and the stories about it scared me when I was a child. My dad's stories about his time there gave me many nightmares through the years. Perhaps these stories may haunt your dreams as well. The old farmhouse is a real haunted house, and the scary ghost stories that happened there are true. In this case, reality is truly more frightening than fiction. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there. The most haunted Bed and Breakfast. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. The old colonial house always seemed out of place. It wasn't so much that the colonial style was different than the architecture of the new modern houses, but it simply felt out of time and place. Sometimes I'd look at that old house and think that it belonged in a different world. I couldn't quite put my finger on why I felt that way, but felt that way I did. The most recent owners had decided to turn the weathered house into a bed and breakfast. Since Coffin Falls, South Carolina, wasn't exactly a booming tourist destination, business was initially slow. Then, things changed. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence, began advertising that their bed and breakfast was haunted. They created flyers that read, "Stay at our dead and breakfast and sleep like the dead. Come see real ghosts." They handed those flyers out in Greenville, South Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. They blasted social media with tales about their place. They really succeeded in creating a lot of buzz. Stories about their haunted bed and breakfast went viral. Before long, it became known as the most haunted bed and breakfast in America. Donnie and Betty Lawrence cunningly drew a steady crowd by exploiting the human tendency toward curiosity. The clever marketing proved quite successful. Tales of ghostly apparitions dressed in 19th century clothing appearing in the old house circulated far and wide. Other haunting stories also spread like wildfire. Disembodied voices, unexplained knocking on windows, doors, and walls were some of the extraordinary experiences that were claimed to regularly occur on the property. Like moths to a flame, people came. The ghost stories multiplied as eager paranormal investigators and thrill seekers became paying customers at the Dead and Breakfast. The guests reported experiencing a number of chilling events. One young woman told of a very unpleasant encounter. She claimed that something touched her inappropriately while she was in the shower. Another pretty young lady purportedly had been touched while she slept in her bed. Many patrons took to social media to share that they had seen shadowy figures and heard toilets flush by themselves. A number of people told of an unnatural and evil feeling in the atmosphere. One guest made and posted a video online about how they would never sleep the same again. This particular guest said that the Dead and Breakfast in Coffin Falls was pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel. The preternatural and supernatural fascinate people. One story became two, and two stories became hundreds. If each story was an unassuming snowflake, they soon transformed into a bomb cyclone of a blizzard. An avalanche of publicity rushed through all forms of media. Having been born and raised in Coffin Falls, I couldn't believe how my town had suddenly risen to national relevance. It was so very surreal. Coffin Falls, a small town in upstate South Carolina, had never been on the national radar. It may as well have been invisible. For most of us who lived there, that was exactly as it should have been. Quiet and peaceful. Isn't that the way small towns should be? The blasted haunted bed and breakfast changed all of that. I wouldn't be surprised if Coffin Falls has been forever changed. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't begrudge the success of others, much less the success of my neighbors. The thing is, there's something about that old house. My gut told me that there is truth to the plethora of stories about that place. If there's one thing that I've learned in my 31 years on this space rock, it's that you ignore your gut at your own expense. Gut feelings aside, there's another reason that I thought that there was something to the scary stories about that place. When my Uncle Paul was a kid, he stayed in that house for one summer. He used to tell me stories about how that old colonial house was haunted. He said that he had heard the water faucet in the bathroom sink mysteriously turn on and off by itself on numerous occasions. One night, he had seen a shadow man walk through the living room while he was sitting on the couch and watching TV. I always took my uncle's stories with a giant grain of salt, because he was a storyteller and a serial liar. Lies spewed from his mouth like a goose drops poop. He's notorious for lying, even when there is no advantage in doing so. Yet, some of his ghost stories from his time there track. His spooky tales match up with the various accounts about that place that are now flooding social media. Numerous ghost stories of the old house captivated the public's attention, but one story in particular really ignited the insatiable curiosity. Being an old house that had been built in the early 1800s, it had become run down and in need of significant repair. If the Lawrences wanted to open up a bed and breakfast, they'd have to pay for a great deal of work to be completed. Various plumbers, painters, and carpenters had worked in the house. One carpenter named Eric Dalton, a man in his 30s, never finished his work there. Mysteriously, he had vanished. One day, he had been seen entering the house, and later that day, no one could find him. He had disappeared. He had been missing for one day, then one day turned into two, and 2 days turned into a week. His girlfriend had said that he had never come back home. That was very bizarre, because in the 2 years that they had lived together, he had never not returned home. In fact, he was a very well-respected carpenter, and he had never walked off a job prior to completing it. Thorough, professional, and quality were words that were associated with his work. The girlfriend of the missing carpenter filed a missing person report with the police. She revealed that her boyfriend had been working in that infernal house for several weeks, and his mental state had drastically changed during that time. He would come home from work and talk about that house all of the time. He told her how special that house was and how it was alive. An obsession with that house consumed him. According to her, hundreds of drawings of that house littered the walls of their home. That was very bizarre because Eric wasn't an artist. He didn't draw pictures as a hobby. The obsessive-compulsive drawings weren't the only strange behavior exhibited by Eric. As the days passed, his demeanor had changed. His girlfriend explained that Eric had increasingly begun to grow more distant. There were nights when, after he had come home from that house, that he'd sit at the kitchen table with an expressionless face for hours. Catatonic is the word that she used to describe it. Donnie and Betty Lawrence had searched their 2 acres of property for Eric, but found nothing. They allowed the police to go through their house, and they too had found no trace of him. Months had passed, and no one had seen or heard from Eric. The tragic disappearance of the carpenter had added to the haunting mystique of the house. Unsolved mysteries and ghost stories are popular, but when you combine the two, a mega-story may be born. All kinds of speculation abounded on TV shows, blogs, vlogs, across social media, and on internet message boards. Everyone seemed to have had an opinion on what had become of Eric, and they weren't afraid to declare even the most wild takes as fact. Some people had no shame, as they made outrageous assertions about Eric, his girlfriend, and his family. In the public eye, Eric and his family had ceased being real people. Instead, they were treated as though they were fictitious characters from a TV series. All of this did ensure that the old dead and breakfast in Coffin Falls would remain in the spotlight. It had reached a level of notoriety that rivaled that of the supposedly haunted house in Amityville, New York. Curious as I was about the supposedly haunted bed and breakfast, my gut told me to stay away. I probably would have stayed away if my job hadn't demanded that I spend a weekend there. Being a writer of a local publication called Spirit of the Upstate, I had little choice in the matter. Growing up as an evangelical Christian, I had been raised to believe that evil demonic spirits were real and that they were always on the prowl. It was a worldview that saw devils infesting and manipulating almost everything outside of our prescribed orbit. Although I had begun to question these things and walked away from the faith of my family, I didn't become an atheist. Striving to have an open mind led me to question things, but it also led me to not be overly skeptical. I believed in the possibility of paranormal entities or occurrences. Too many of my friends had shared spooky ghost stories with me, and at the very least, they genuinely seemed to believe that what they had experienced was real. The world is a very strange place, and I don't doubt that there are fascinating things that we haven't yet discovered or begun to comprehend. The possibilities of all the amazing things that are out there fascinate me. Yet, even though a stay at the purportedly most haunted bed and breakfast in America seems like an irresistible opportunity to encounter a spirit, my intuition screamed at me. My gut told me that there was danger in that place. So, because I wanted to keep my job, I agreed to spend a weekend at the house that had captured the imagination of the whole country. Writers are lucky if they can make a living off of smithing words. I had certainly been very thankful for the ability to make a decent living doing what I loved. I was willing to take some risks in order to make sure that I would continue living my dream. Really, was my boss's demand unreasonable? How dangerous could a house be? On Friday, the 14th of April, I arrived at the Dead and Breakfast. Even though the Lawrences spent a large sum of money on renovations, the white paint on the outside of the house was very chipped and aged. It seemed apparent that they had purposely left the outside of the house looking ancient. As a result, the house looked like you would expect a haunted house to look. As I walked toward the front door, a foreboding feeling washed over me. The house looked as alien as I had remembered. I knocked on the front door. Donnie Lawrence opened the door and greeted me. "Welcome to Coffin Falls Haunted Dead and Breakfast. You must be Leo Kingsley, the writer." Smiling, I said, "Yes, sir. Guilty as charged. This is some place that you have here." Donnie's brown eyes widened as he smiled and responded. "Yes, it sure is a hell of a special place. What kind of story are you planning on writing about our historic home?" Briefly considering the question, I gently bit my lower lip and answered. "Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure yet. I've come here with an open mind, and we'll see how things go. I don't have any expectations." Donnie laughed and replied, "The thing about this place is that you don't need to have expectations in order to experience something unusual here. The vast majority of our guests have reported having paranormal encounters. If you stay the whole weekend, I'd be very surprised if you don't witness some ghostly activity." Smirking, I responded, "That sure would be interesting. I'll keep my eyes open." The eyes of Donnie Lawrence narrowed as he replied, "Oh, it would be very interesting. Word of caution, though, the spirits here aren't known to be friendly. It is a good idea to keep an eye out while you're here." After that strange greeting came to an end, Donnie showed me to my room on the second floor of the house. My room was painted red. Unlike the chipped paint and semi-dilapidated look of the exterior of the house, the interior was in good condition and very well kept. A queen-sized bed with black sheets and an orange comforter rested against a wall on which hung a spooky old black and white photo of the house. Though the room was well adorned, I couldn't shake the feeling of pure negativity. The air in the room felt like it was weighed down. It's a very difficult sensation to describe adequately. After I had settled in is not the right choice of words here, because I didn't feel at home. I thought about how I was going to spend my time in this place. I had decided that I would talk with Donnie and Betty Lawrence, walk around, and see what I could see. Donnie and Betty Lawrence were young. They looked to be around my age. Donnie, like me, was around 6 feet tall. He had shiny black hair, and he wore it in a ponytail. His wife, Betty, had shoulder-length red hair. Her eyes were a very pretty shade of green. She was short in stature, but her presence was dignified and commanding. I had gone into the kitchen with them to get some coffee. The three of us took our coffee cups and walked into the living room and sat by the fireplace. "Betty, what's it like living here?" I asked as I sipped my coffee. "Well, it's certainly different. I never feel alone here. I like having a house that has lived a little," Betty replied as she giggled. "This house has a lot more history than the average house, that's for sure. I wonder what its walls have seen," I remarked. "Why don't you ask them?" she asked as her lips slightly curled. "Right, I should have thought of that. This place is kind of alive, at least if the stories are to be believed," I responded after I briefly laughed. "This place is alive. Its history speaks to us. The past residents here never left. They remain with us. I'm quite sure that they are watching us now," said Betty as she studied me. "Have you all actually seen a ghost? A full-bodied apparition?" Donnie and Betty nodded their heads in the affirmative. Donnie crossed his legs and said, "Oh yes, I've seen the apparitions of several of the ghostly residents. I've seen a woman dressed in 18th century clothing walk right through the front door. I've also seen a man wearing a top hat walk down the stairs and then dissipate into thin air. Then there's a black shadow that appears and disappears. The shadow has the shape of a man, but something about the shape seems inhuman." Chills shot down my spine. I looked at my hosts and said, "Wow, it sounds like there's a tremendous amount of activity here. Thank you so much for allowing me to record our conversation. I will definitely play this back later and reflect on it." The three of us continued to talk for another hour. They shared many ghostly experiences with me. Their accounts sounded fantastic, but I got the sense that they were telling the truth. I'm pretty good at reading people and sniffing out BS, but I didn't detect any BS here. Yet I couldn't help but think that they were hiding something. They were very polite and pleasant, but I sensed that there was some kind of darkness that was hiding within them. I couldn't put my finger on why I had gotten that impression. They were delightful, and yet, much like the house, something seemed off. After we concluded our conversation, we walked back to the kitchen to put our cups in the sink. I couldn't believe my eyes. The chairs had been stacked up on the kitchen table. Pots and pans were spread around the room. Some pots were on the floor. Some pans were on the top of the refrigerator and stove. This was not how we had left the room, and we had been together the entire time since. The odd occurrence had taken me aback. I wondered if someone else had done this. I didn't jump to any conclusions, but I was aware that a normal explanation existed for this bizarre scene. A ghost wasn't necessary to accomplish this. Betty told me that this had happened here from time to time. Later that evening, when I was in my room, I played back the recording of the evening's conversation. A third of the way through the recording, I heard something that made the blood in my veins run like an icy river in Alaska. I half expected the spiritual equivalent of a polar bear to maul me. I had heard a voice on the recording that I hadn't heard during the conversation. The voice didn't belong to Donnie or Betty. The apparently disembodied voice said, "We have such delightful plans for you." I couldn't come up with an ordinary explanation for the sinister-sounding voice on the recording. It wasn't the kind of fuzzy, unclear evidence that you usually see on TV paranormal shows. This recording was crystal clear. My strange experiences didn't end there either. Over the weekend, I had heard knocking on the window to my room. When I looked to see what it was, there was no one there. A ladder would have been needed to reach my bedroom window, and I didn't see a ladder. I had tracked the sound of footsteps as they climbed up the stairs, walked down the hallway, until they approached my door and finally sounded like they had arrived at my bedside. Yet, I didn't see anyone there. On another occasion, I got out of the shower and discovered a message written on the steam of the bathroom mirror. The message read, "We're watching you." Brave is certainly not a word that I would use to describe myself, but it took all of my willpower to stay in that house for the entire weekend. If my job and potentially my writing career hadn't been at stake, there's no chance that I would have remained there past that Friday night. An evil presence was with me throughout my entire stay at that so-called haunted dead and breakfast. Although I was truthfully terrified while I was there, I was lucky to get out unscathed. Over the year that followed, 3 dead bodies had been found at the old house. The coroner concluded that all 3 deaths were homicides. It seemed that a serial killer had been targeting patrons of the notorious Dead and Breakfast. News of a serial killer hunting victims at the most famous haunted house in America added fuel to the raging inferno of national interest. Sensational stories like this captured the imagination of the nation. Rather than being frightened away by the real deadly danger, many clamored to stay at the house. Some wanted to solve the serial killer case. Others believed that ghosts or demonic entities were really responsible for the 3 deaths. The police had suspected that Donnie or Betty Lawrence were responsible. Police were surveilling the house when an officer saw a man in a hoodie climb under the house. The officers followed him, handcuffed him, and took him to the police station. They determined the identity of the suspect. He was Eric Dalton, the carpenter that had gone missing. Eric had been living in the crawl space of the old house. He had built a secret passage into the house. He climbed up from the crawl space and entered the house undetected. He had stalked guests, played tricks on them, and eventually he escalated to murder. Police determined that he had also killed 3 other people at different locations. His victims ranged from 16 years of age to 67. 4 of his victims were female, and 2 were male. Everyone that stayed at the haunted Dead and Breakfast could have ended up dead. While many of the strange events that took place at the house could be attributed to Eric Dalton, not everything could. Eric couldn't have been responsible for that voice that I had picked up on the recording of my conversation with the Lawrences. What of the footsteps that I had heard by my bed at night? Was it Eric who had visited me and wrote a message on the bathroom mirror while I showered? The door had been locked. Still more curious are the other stories that have a link back to that diabolical house. No less than 20 people that had stayed there developed serious clinical mental illness. 8 of them went on to commit murder, and 3 of the 8 became serial killers. Did the house attract mentally unstable and violent individuals, or did it make them become that way? My research shows that, much like Eric Dalton, none of them had a prior history of mental illness. None of them had criminal records. Now that Eric Dalton is in prison, the haunted Dead and Breakfast remains open. It's the most infamous haunted house in America, maybe even in the whole world. Books are being written about it, and I have no doubt that TV series and movies will portray the haunting events. The tragic deaths of those innocent people have increased the macabre legend. I believe that the story isn't over. That house is evil, and evil never really dies. Died suddenly, the witch that hovers over my bed. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. At 13 o'clock she comes for me. As reliable as the rising of the moon each night, the old hag rises above my bed when I try to go to sleep. Night after night, the terror is the same. Every night I walk down the hall, enter my bedroom, turn off the lights, and climb into bed, pulling the covers up to my mouth as if the bedsheets were a protective force field. I hope to create a safe space. Feeling safe and secure has become an alien concept. Rather than finding the warmth and comfort that is normally offered by one's own bedroom, I instead find that my room is permeated and disturbed by an unnatural feeling. A dark and heavy, sinister sensation surrounds me and wraps me up like an evil blanket. It always feels like the diabolical, invisible blanket possesses a tremendous gravity. It weighs me down. This powerful dark force makes me wonder if it will crush me, open up a hole, and devour me. The oppressive, negative atmosphere has become a part of my life. It dwells in my room. It almost feels as if it's becoming a part of me. I'm not sure, but I suspect that it, whatever it is, wants to dwell in me and take control of me. Darkness is all I see. I no longer believe that I'll ever be free. In a dank, gloomy pit will I forever be. Even when I'm not in my room, this terribly wicked feeling returns whenever I think about these traumatic events. As soon as I think about her, that evil witch, goosebumps rise all over my flesh. When I close my eyes, her monstrous face haunts me. Even now, as I record my story, as I sit in the safety of my car, parked at my high school, I can't shake her off. She has her insidious fingernails hooked deep into me. As I tell you my story, I'm reliving the horror. Frack, this is insane. I'm 16 years old. I'm a linebacker on the varsity football team, and I'm perpetually scared. If this continues, I'm afraid that she'll either kill me, or I'll simply lose my mind. Maybe I've lost it already. If you saw her, and I hope that you never do, you would be a wreck too. In case the witch does kill me, I'm telling you my story while there's still time. Should I turn up dead, know that the evil hag was responsible for it. The witch always comes at night. When I am lying in my bed and the atmosphere in my room is heavy with fear, that's when she comes. It's always the same. I open my eyes even though I don't want to. I'm afraid of what I'll see, but I'm even more afraid of what will happen if I don't look. That's when I see her face, that horrific face of pure evil. Her skin is greenish and wrinkled. Wearing a black dress or a black robe, it's hard to differentiate in the low light. She floats above the floor, levitating a few feet off of the floor. She floats until she rises above my bed. Once she is above me, merely inches from the ceiling, she hovers there for what feels like forever. Her black, conical hat creates a shadow that looks as though a sword is emerging from her head. Her shadow seems to move and change into various, terrifying shapes, even though she is hovering in place above me. Filled with fear and the deepest dread, I look at her as I tremble. My heart flutters in my chest as my breaths become short and rapid. Her eyes, those awful, glowing, green eyes, stare at me. Her body is humanoid in appearance and yet alien. Her face is withered, wrinkled, and has a supernatural green complexion. Monstrous. Her appearance is absolutely monstrous. Her flesh not only appears to be rotting, but she smells rotten too. She smells like a dead animal that has been left out for weeks in the hot summer sun. She smells so foul that it causes me to gag. The gagging adds to my anxiety as my throat begins to narrow and restricts the airflow to my lungs. Will I die of fear? Will I suffer cardiac arrest? Or will I suffocate as my throat closes? Being literally scared to death sounds crazy. Yet, my nightly visitations by the evil old witch aren't unique. Throughout recorded history, people have reported having similar horrific encounters. There are centuries of documented cases where an old hag sits on the chest of people as they try to fall asleep at night. Victims report finding it to be difficult to breathe as her weight sinks down on them. Modern psychology purports that these are nothing more than the phenomena of night terrors and sleep paralysis. The scientific explanation for this gave me reassurance when I first learned of them, but that comfort was soon torn asunder. During one of my nightly demonic visitations, the witch scratched my chest, and the red, bloody marks remained with me weeks after the attack. Now that I know that my nightly intruder is real, I'm constantly anxious. I'm always on edge. My fight or flight response seems to be permanently switched on, and it's exhausting me. The constant rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins leaves me feeling as though I've just finished sprinting in a race. Something as simple and ordinary as hearing the central air unit turn on stimulates a shot of adrenaline. Combine this with the precious little sleep that I get, and it's easy to see that I can't go on like this for much longer. If nothing changes, I will surely break down. Maybe this is what the sinister witch wants. As the hideous hag hovers over my bed at night, she repeats the words, "Let me in. Just let me in. Let me in, and this will all stop." The sinister tone of her voice always sends chills down my spine. It matches her demonic appearance. It's a terrible voice that I'll never forget, and sometimes I fear that it may well be the last thing that I ever hear. Whether I'm paralyzed by fear or by her black magic, I do not know. I only know that I'm unable to move when she comes. When I see her grotesque face, with its unnatural, glowing green eyes, and I smell her putrid odor. I want to scream. Then I hear her hellish voice spew the words, "Let me in. Just let me in. Let me in, and this will all stop." I would writhe like a worm to escape her if I could. Unfortunately, there is no escape from her, and so instead, I writhe like a worm on the inside as my soul squirms where my body cannot. What's worse is that I have recently learned that the evil witch is now stalking my little brother, Stevie, at night. Stevie is 10 years old. He told me about the nasty old woman that comes to him when he goes to bed. My heart sank when he told me about this nightly visitation. I knew that it wasn't just his imagination run amok after hearing my stories about the old witch, because I never told him about her. He explicitly described her appearance as well as her rank smell. The details match up exactly with what I have observed. I don't know what to do. I want to protect my baby brother from the witch, but how can I protect him when I can't even protect myself? Who or what the witch truly is, I don't know. She looks like a witch, but looks can be deceiving. I guess that she could be a witch that mastered the art of astral projection, or she could be a ghost or a demon, or perhaps she's the ghost of a very evil witch. Whatever it isn't anything good. It is certainly evil. For a time, I had wondered if this was the result of living in a haunted house, but I don't think that is the case here. My family has lived in this house for the past 12 years, and we never experienced anything that would have suggested that we had a ghost problem. More than that, I talked to some friends at school, and they shared their scary stories with me. As it turns out, a few friends from school have also been harassed by the sadistic witch with the green, glowing eyes. There are whispers that say that the evil witch came for Jackie. A week ago, Jackie, a junior, died suddenly overnight. Her friends said that she had become a fearful shell of herself, and that she complained about being attacked by an ugly witch in her room. After learning of these stories which matched my own, I searched the internet for answers. What I found was beyond troubling. All across America, there were news reports of people dying suddenly. Those who died suddenly varied in age from kids to the elderly. Various conspiracy theories attempt to explain what's going on, but one particular theory struck me to my core. The green witch with the glowing green eyes was described on various websites and across numerous social media platforms. The descriptions of the witch matched what I've witnessed to a T. Otherwise, healthy people are dying at the drop of a hat. Perhaps they are dying at the drop of a witch's conical hat. Time after time, death often seems to follow the people who have been tormented by the Green Witch. In other accounts, people say that those who have claimed to have been haunted by the Green Witch didn't die, but that they changed and became angry, violent, and psychotic. In all the accounts, whether the person died or became mentally unstable after encountering the witch, one thing was clear. No one seems to have escaped her without paying a grave price. Things are exponentially worse than I could have dreamed. I now see that the Green Witch with the glowing green eyes is a problem on a much larger scale and with a much larger reach than I had ever imagined. If she is haunting people across the country, then I can't simply sleep in a friend's house to escape her. She has potentially killed hundreds of people. It's quite possible that she has either possessed or driven hundreds of people, perhaps even thousands, insane. My blood freezes over as I think about the gravity of the situation. I feel like I've been pulled into a black hole, from which nothing can escape. Even now, as I finish telling you my horrific story, the Green Witch's sinister voice echoes in my mind. Let me in. Just let me in. Let me in. And this will all stop. Will I let her in? No. No way. Wait. I don't know. I'm so tired. I just want this to stop. Maybe I can make a deal with her. Maybe I can offer myself to her in exchange for leaving my brother alone. I know it all sounds crazy, but I have to do whatever I can to save my baby brother. I would do anything for my brother, but I can't forget that the witch, whatever she truly is evil, and evil beings cannot be trusted. Making a deal with her is foolish. If I could just get a good 10 hours of sleep, I would be able to think much more clearly. Time for me to get back to my house. What would you do if you were in my place? I pray that you never receive a visit from the Green Witch with the glowing green eyes. If I die suddenly, please don't forget what I've told you. I will do everything I can to fight the evil old hag and survive. But if I should die trying, know that it was no accident or some natural cause. Share this story, and maybe we can figure out the answers together. The truth is out there. Shocking video that haunts me. Beware, don't watch. Listening to scary stories and watching videos about ghosts on social media was always harmless fun. It was a safe way to satiate my curiosity about otherworldly mysteries. At least, that's what I used to think. One day, a video called Shocking Video That Haunts Me appeared in my recommended videos. Although the sensationalistic title caused me to roll my eyes for a moment, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. If the video was truly shocking, and if it did provide compelling evidence of a real haunting, then I didn't want to miss it. While I thought that it was highly unlikely that the video would live up to the promise of the titillating title, I was afraid that I'd miss out if I didn't check it out. I clicked on the link. My life would never be the same again. It's astounding how such a seemingly small, simple, split-second act can have catastrophic, life-altering consequences. Something that I had done hundreds or thousands of times in the past had, on this occasion, manifested the unimaginable. Had I known then what I know now, I never would have clicked on that damned video. The video began in an ordinary way. The voice of a young woman explained how she had come across a video with the title, Shocking Video That Haunts Me. An eerie video loop of fog accompanied her as she told her story. She then described the appearance of the disturbing apparitions that she had seen in the video. As she described the ghosts, they appeared on the screen of my phone. As soon as I saw them, they creeped me out. Something about the images seemed unusual and unnatural. The video was creepier than I had expected it would be, but it certainly wasn't shocking. After I had finished watching it, I concluded that it had been clickbait, and that I'd forget all about it in no time. I then put on a video made by one of my favorite content creators. The video was an original science fiction story. About halfway through the episode, it happened. One of the creepy images from the earlier clickbait video appeared in the unrelated science fiction video that I was watching. A slight chill began to rise on my upper spine. Did I really see the same ghost from the earlier video in this new video? I rewound the video a minute back and then hit play. This time, there was no trace of the ghostly apparition. I figured that I must have imagined it. I didn't think any more of it. Later in the evening, I used my phone to surf through social media. Steve Gimble, a classmate, had posted a selfie of himself at the gym. That kind of thing always irritated me. It's fine if you work out, but do you have to broadcast the play-by-play to the world? I lift weights and play football, but I'm not narcissistic enough to think that sharing multiple pictures of myself would enrich the lives of anyone. Annoyed as I was, those were my thoughts at the time as I scrolled through my social media feed. That's when I saw it. I saw a creepy female ghost with long black hair that hid the features of her face. Yet again, it was an image from the video that I had watched earlier that day. Rubbing my eyes, I looked at the feed on my phone again. The disturbing, ghostly image remained. The image was where the cover picture for a fast food restaurant ad should have been. It was bizarre, and it didn't make any sense. There's no way that a fast food burger joint would be using a creepy ghost picture as part of their marketing campaign. We weren't anywhere near Halloween, either. This happened in the beginning of May. I told myself that it must have been nothing more than a glitch with the software. Yet, there was a nagging concern and doubt in the back of my mind. This was the second time that a creepy image from the peculiar horror video had popped up since I had watched it. The next day, I was sitting in my history class taking notes on my tablet. The words on my writing app faded away, and they were replaced by the chilling image of the ghostly girl with long black hair that covered her face. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. A cold chill went down my spine as my heart seemed to have dropped into the pit of my stomach. That's when it happened. The ghostly arm from the still picture moved until it penetrated through the tablet's screen. The ghastly arm had escaped from the confines of the screen. It reached for me. It tried to grasp me. I let out an involuntary scream as I jumped out of my chair. Filled with terror, I didn't think about my reaction. I merely reacted in the moment. A primal animal instinct had taken over. My teacher, along with my classmates, stared at me like I was crazy. They hadn't seen anything paranormal. The only thing that they perceived to be strange was my behavior and the pale look on my face. The teacher remarked, "You look like you've seen a ghost." After the adrenaline had subsided, the feeling of fear had been replaced by mortification. I must have looked like a raving madman. It was as though I could feel their thoughts of judgment and ridicule. The rest of my day at school passed without event, albeit the sheer terror that I had experienced had gravely shaken me. The lingering sense of dread remained. A nagging feeling of foreboding continued to lurk in the recesses of my mind. It was a sensation that I had never experienced before. Although it's difficult to adequately describe, it's something like the deep fear that you feel after having a particularly bad and vivid nightmare. Unlike the after effects of a nightmare, this ominous feeling didn't fade away. Not only that, but this couldn't have been a nightmare because I had been wide awake in the middle of class. If not a nightmare, then what could it have been? If it was a nightmare, then that would mean that I could no longer differentiate between dreams and reality. None of the potential explanations were comforting. Later that day, I returned to my house after school. Ghostly images from the video continued to surface. The chilling image of a lady in white appeared on my screen as I FaceTimed my friend, Christy. When I saw the creepy image, my heart beat faster. My body had instinctively detected a dangerous threat that my brain couldn't comprehend. It had been over 24 hours since I had watched that video, and too many bizarre things had happened to be coincidental. Prior to watching that video, I had never seen any of those ghostly images before. Then, within 24 hours of watching the video, I had seen the same ghostly images pop up in unexpected places. The ghostly arm that reached out of my tablet had been truly shocking. Something was going on. Whether it was something paranormal or the symptoms of a mind going mad, I did not know. Frankly, I was not sure which of the two possibilities is more terrifying. At 15 minutes past midnight, I was awakened in my bed by a spine-tingling voice. It was a female voice that had a sinister and unnatural tone. The phantom voice said, "Griffin, Griffin, you opened the link, and now we're here. Forever will you live in fear, unless you share your despair." The blood in my veins turned to ice. As my blood froze over, I instantly became paralyzed by fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The only thing that I could manage to move were my eyes. In the darkness of night, my eyes frantically darted to and fro, searching for the source of the sinister voice. I found nothing apart from the twisted things in my imagination. It remained that way for what must have been 5 minutes. That's when the clouds in the sky parted and moonlight streamed into my bedroom. The melancholy light of the moon revealed a hideous, green, feminine, demonic face. I instantly remembered it as one of the faces from the infernal video. An overwhelming feeling of pure, oppressive evil weighed me down. The thick atmosphere was otherworldly. It was an unnatural and malignant presence. I wanted to flee from it as fast as I could, but I was paralyzed. Completely impotent, my heart pounded furiously as my eyes exploded in size. This unadulterated terror was unlike anything that I had ever experienced before. I thought it possible that, if this evil spirit didn't kill me, then I'd die of fright. Sometime after the evil phantom face departed, the paralysis wore off, and the unearthly atmosphere lightened some. I sat up and pulled the bedsheets up over my mouth, as though the light fabric was a protective shield. Shaking and trembling all over, I sat in my bed until the sun rose in the morning. The coming light of the sun seemed to warm the bitter chill that harassed me all throughout the night, while the light of the day lessened the fearful impacts of the dreadful night. It couldn't remove them entirely. A sickening sense of dread accompanied me that day and every day that followed. The ghastly images from the horrific video continued to appear where I'd least expect them to. I'd see the disturbing images when I texted my friends, used a tablet, watched movies, shows, or videos. Perhaps the most shocking repeating occurrence was when the ghostly images would come to life and jump out from the screen. As the frequency of those terrific events increased, so too did their potency. Each additional occurrence became ever more severe. It had escalated to the point that the ghostly images hadn't merely come to life and jumped out from the screen and into the room with me, but they proceeded to touch and attack me. On one occasion, the demonic being scratched my chest and left marks. On another occasion, the dreadful girl with the long black hair reached for my throat, grabbed it, and started to choke me. I gasped for air as I was being strangled. The level of fear that I felt was off of the charts. The fear didn't dissipate after the attack either. It couldn't have been my imagination because there were very real choke marks on my neck. My parents suspected that I was being bullied at school, and my teachers and classmates suspected that I was being physically abused by my parents. When I finally told my parents what was really going on, they didn't believe me. They made me an appointment with a psychologist. They feared that I may have been suffering from the onset of schizoaffective disorder. This lack of understanding hurt me, but what hurt the most was the fact that my family didn't believe me. I felt like I was a tiny island in an ocean whose horizon was darkened by a ferocious Category 5 hurricane. I felt like the dark, powerful, and relentless storm surge was going to drown me and sweep my dead body out to sea. The intense loneliness was eased only when I discovered that I wasn't alone. A girl from school had recently begun suffering from the same exact phenomena. Her name was Katie, and she too had watched the video. Katie loved scary stories and horror movies. She believed in the reality of ghosts, and her curiosity had gotten the better of her. When she saw a video with the title, "Shocking Video That Haunts Me," she couldn't resist clicking on it. Like me, she initially thought that the video was a bit unsettling, but not particularly remarkable. Then, within hours of watching the video, she began to see the images from the video in her social media feed, and then on her phone, tablet, and TV. Until we shared our traumatic experiences with each other, we had mistakenly thought that we were all alone. Katie and I had compared notes and shared our theories on what was going on. One thing that we agreed on was that this was a real manifestation of the spirit world. We knew that this wasn't a shared hallucination. The two of us believed that, if we didn't resolve this, we would go mad, become possessed, or be killed. We decided that we had to do something, and we were going to have to do it ourselves. Our parents, teachers, and doctors didn't believe us, and they had no clue about the hellish reality that now tormented us. We determined that, if we didn't find a way to stop this, I would be the first to fall to this evil. I had watched the video a week before she did. This was the reason that my experiences were more acute. Like a deadly disease, mine had spread further. My evil affliction was significantly more advanced. After long nights of discussion, we settled on a working theory to act upon. The video had to be the catalyst for all of our troubles. Instead of merely opening a link that led to a video, we had opened a link to the spirit world, and the spirit world was filled with ravenous dark entities. While we didn't understand exactly how watching a video could open up a door to the spirit world, it seemed obvious that's exactly what had happened. Really, the how of it wasn't important, so far as our purposes were concerned. What we were interested in, above all else, was survival. We wanted to stop the escalating horror. One significant thing that our experiences had in common was the message from our nightly evil visitor. The heart of the message was the same for each of us. On a nightly basis, the sinister voice said to us, "You opened the link, and now we're here. Forever will you live in fear, unless you share your despair." We concluded that these weren't just scary words meant to frighten us. It was a real message. We had just been too consumed by fear to think straight. The evil entity wants us to share our fear and despair. Like a virus, it wants to spread. It wants to invade other hosts. We think that this is the answer. At the end of the original video, the person said, "Share the shocking video, or risk being forever haunted by these sinister spirits." When I had originally watched the video, I thought that the threat at the end of the video had been little more than a desperate attempt to create a viral video. Now it seems clear that the video had been a desperate attempt to escape the evil by helping it go viral. Katie and I had shared the original video in the hopes that doing so would free us from this hell. The problem is that it didn't work. The hauntings continued, and they continued to grow more severe. Our despair deepened. Katie suggested that I make my own video detailing what I have experienced. She believed that since we had ignored the original warning and instruction of the video, that we had to go a step further to appease the powerful entities behind all of this suffering. This is the reason for the video that you're watching right now. "Shocking Video That Haunts Me" is the title for a reason, and I added the subtitle, "Beware, Don't Watch," because I can't, in good conscience, publish this without a warning. Maybe I shouldn't have made this video at all. Perhaps it means that I'm a weak man. If you don't share this video, and if you then become haunted by the same vile spirits that have haunted me, maybe you too will be tempted to make a video just like this one. After weeks of sleepless nights and perpetual harassment by disembodied entities, you might be surprised by what you would be willing to do to make it stop. Haunted Possessions. The Sinister Scarecrow. Chilling tales and scary stories. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. It happened again. Yet another dead body was found in the cornfields. Seemingly without fail, at least one dead body turns up on the land of the old farm every autumn. Junction Ridge used to have a lot of farms, but now only a few remain. One particular farm stands out. No matter what the name of the current owner may be, everyone simply calls it the Old Grasslow Farm. A lot of local folks believe that the Old Grasslow Farmhouse, along with its land, are cursed. While calling a place cursed may seem superstitious and outdated in the 21st century, the facts do tell a strange story. For instance, the Junction Herald Tribune recently reported a grotesque discovery on the Old Grasslow Farm. The current owner of the farm, Mr. Eric Kirby, was out working in the cornfield when he saw it. The bloody, lifeless corpse of a young man laid in his cornfield. The body had been badly mauled. Lacerations covered the cold, pale flesh. Red blood spatter covered the yellow cornstalks. The scene was horrific. The Junction Ridge Police Department, with the help of forensics, determined that a scythe had been used to kill the young victim. A police officer recovered the weapon. The blood-stained scythe had been found in the hands of a scarecrow that stood overlooking the cornfield. The scarecrow was dressed in a black robe with a black conical crowned hat on the top of its pumpkin head. The pumpkin had been carved with sharp but wide eyes and a fiercely menacing mouth. This creepy scarecrow was attached to a pole. It stood an intimidating 13 feet above the ground. The police took Mr. Eric Kirby down to the police station for questioning. He was, of course, the first and obvious suspect. Both the victim and the murder weapon had been found in his field. In addition to those potentially incriminating facts, an incident had occurred in those fields the night of the murder. 5 kids, ranging from 17 to 19 years old, had partied in the Old Grasslow fields the night of the killing. The murder victim, Eddie, was part of the partying group. The kids had gone to the cornfield to drink some alcohol and smoke some herb. In a small town in the Hudson Valley, there isn't much to do, and there are few places to do the things that kids want to do. So, partying in a place like a quiet and isolated cornfield can become pretty routine. 3 guys and 2 girls, named Katie and Amy, had been having a good country time when they began to hear some noises. They had heard the sound of someone or some animal moving through the corn. They weren't alone. Inebriated as they had been, their reaction time wasn't exactly the greatest. One of the girls, Katie, thought that she had seen a dark silhouette with a pumpkin for a head moving in the corn. Frightened as she was, she dismissed what she had seen and chalked it up to what they had smoked. "Hey, you no good little SOBs! This is private property! Get out of my field! This corn isn't harvestable, and it's because you keep coming out here doing God knows what, and you damage my crops!" Mr. Kirby yelled as he ran towards them. Eddie replied, "Hey, old man, want to join us? We know that you're an alcoholic, and that you like to hit your stepdaughter. Why don't you come and try that crap with me, huh?" Mr. Kirby, who had been drinking, ran towards them with a scythe in his hands and screamed, "I'm going to kill you! You're dead!" Eddie and his 4 friends ran out of that field as fast as they could as they yelled, "You're crazy, you sick drunk!" Having questioned the 4 surviving friends, the police had more than an abundance of evidence to arrest Eric Kirby on suspicion of murder. They also learned that Eric Kirby was an alcoholic with a nasty temper. He had violently raised his hand to his stepdaughter, Amy, on a number of occasions. Eric Kirby had motive and opportunity to kill Eddie. This case seemed to be clear-cut. Amy cried in her room. Eddie had been one of the few people that had treated her well. Ever since Amy, her mom, and her stepdad moved to Junction Ridge that summer, she had a hard time fitting in. Being a 16-year-old girl was difficult enough, but being a 16-year-old girl that moved to a small town makes everything harder. At school, the cool kids bullied and made fun of her. The popular girls laughed at her and mocked her because her parents were farmers, and because she dressed in goth clothing. They called her a spooky freak and a ghoulish goth chick because she was a horror fan. One of the hidden but real reasons that the popular kids emotionally bullied her was because they were intimidated by her. She was smart and beautiful. Therefore, they saw her as a threat to the hierarchy of their social status. Amy knew that things would go from bad to worse at school now. Not only was her friend murdered, but her wretched stepfather had been arrested for the murder. She foresaw that the cool kids would now call her the spooky kid of a drunk and deranged killer. As much as the prospect of even worse bullying troubled her, it was the tragic loss of Eddie that filled her with a seemingly bottomless sorrow. If the physical abuse by her wicked stepfather, the murder of Eddie, and being bullied for being different wasn't enough, then the strange things she had experienced on the farm certainly were. On a number of occasions, Amy had seen strange things. Sometimes she directly saw strange things, and other times she saw shadowy things from the corner of her eye. At the center of all her unsettling experiences was the Scarecrow. The creepy Scarecrow unnerved her to the marrow of her bones. In July, shortly after they moved to the farm, Amy noticed that the Scarecrow would inexplicably be in different positions. One time, as she headed to the barn, she saw that the Scarecrow had its right hand raised as its pumpkin head faced straight ahead toward the house. Then, as she returned from the barn, which was on the left side of the house, she noticed that the pumpkin head had turned towards the barn. It had been looking directly at her. Even though it was a sweltering hot and humid summer day, an ice-cold chill traveled down her spine. She felt an unnatural presence. Then there was the time that she had been working in the flower garden, and she heard someone running in the field. Startled, she swirled her head to the sound of someone running through the field. As she turned her head, she froze, not on account of what she saw, but on what she didn't see. The Scarecrow was not in its normal place on the pole in the front of the house. It was nowhere to be seen. One night, Amy was doing dishes at the kitchen sink. She had been in a good mood that day, because she had gotten back from her friend Katie's house. They had watched The Lost Boys. It was one of their favorite vampire movies. Watching her favorite horror movies always comforted Amy. They were an escape from the troubles of the real world. Horror films were a place where the outcast often beat the big bad monster. In these films, people like herself weren't the losers. No, they were the survivors. More than that, they were the heroes. The other reason that horror movies felt like home to her was because she used to watch them together with her biological father. Those were the wonderful days in the time before he died of cancer. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. While washing the dishes in the kitchen sink, Amy's heart felt warm and filled with love. That's when she saw two yellowish red eyes staring at her through the window. In the darkness beyond the glass window stood the dreadful Scarecrow. Its pumpkin head looked right at her. It was only 3 feet away from the window. Amy dropped the glass cup that she had been washing, and the glass shattered. Her sense of love and peace had shattered along with the broken glass. A fearful dread washed over her. The noise of the accident brought her stepfather into the kitchen, and he slapped her right across her face. Her nose bled. The Scarecrow watched it all. Amy thought that she must have been going mad. Her late grandmother on her mother's side had suffered from schizophrenia. Amy had feared that she too might one day slip into the land of mental illness. What she was seeing with the Scarecrow made her think that the gene that can cause mental illness might have been triggered in her. She had read that schizophrenia often comes on between the teenage years and your early 30s. She was 16, so maybe it was beginning. Going to see a psychiatrist might have been Amy's next step had she not spoken to Katie after the murder of Eddie. With tears in her eyes, Katie lit a cigarette and began to talk. Amy, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I have to tell you something. Please don't laugh, okay? Said Katie as she put the cigarette to her lips and inhaled deeply. Katie, I promise I won't laugh. You can tell me anything, anything at all. I'm here for you. You're about the only friend that I have left here, gently replied Amy. Okay, I saw something the night that Eddie was murdered. It's an impossible image that I haven't been able to get out of my head. I just feel something deep inside of me, and it's telling me to tell you what I saw. Before your psycho stepfather came out and chased us with a fracking weapon, I saw something with a pumpkin for a head moving through the field, explained Katie as the cigarette shook in her trembling hand. With her eyes wide, Amy took out a pack of cigarettes from her purse and quickly took out a cigarette from the pack. With her hands now trembling, she lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. As she exhaled, she began to tell Katie all about her experiences with the creepy scarecrow and how she sincerely believed she was going mad. Amy added that she too had seen the menacing scarecrow that night. The two friends, although terribly frightened, felt comfort in confessing to each other what they had experienced. Something unexplainable was afoot, but at least they weren't dealing with this alone. They had each other. At times like that, having someone to lean on means everything. Evil wants to isolate you. Like a predator, it cunningly works to separate its prey from the herd. In the case of humans, our family and friends are our herd. Like a lion or wolf, once the prey has been separated, the vicious attack commences. In order to make sure that a deranged person hadn't been impersonating a scarecrow, Amy and Katie inspected the Sinister Scarecrow. They confirmed what their intuition had suggested. The scarecrow was no man. It was made of straw, and its head was a carved pumpkin. There was no way for someone to put that pumpkin on their head as a mask. The bottom of the pumpkin was intact. There was no place to slide your head into the bottom. The girls agreed that this had been the exact pumpkin head that they had seen attached to this scarecrow as it stalked around the fields. While both Amy and Katie had an extensive knowledge of horror movies and folklore about monsters, they weren't aware of any significant lore about paranormal scarecrows. They decided that a visit to the town historian was to be their next step. Old man Mr. Fox was the town historian of Junction Ridge. He was well acquainted with the folklore of the Hudson Valley. The two girls drove to Mr. Fox's house. A cold September rain began to fall. Cold and wet, they knocked on the door. The kindly Mr. Ted Fox opened the door. The girls explained that they were interested in learning more about the history of Amy's property. Mr. Fox answered, "Come on in, ladies. It's miserable out there. Come inside before you catch a cold." Amy responded, "Thanks so much, Mr. Fox." As the girls took off their raincoats and hung them by the door, Mr. Fox said, "I'm so sorry for the loss of your dear friend Eddie. What a terrible tragedy. You're going through a lot. If there's anything I can do to help, you girls just let me know." "Thanks, Mr. Fox. As a matter of fact, there is something that we were hoping that you could help us with," Amy answered as she and Katie sat down on the couch in the living room. "Ah, yes. Yes. You would like to know more about the history of your house," said Mr. Fox softly. "Yes, please. That would be very much appreciated," said Amy as she pushed her silky black hair away from her eyes. Mr. Fox folded his arms across his chest as he began to tell them the history of Amy's farmhouse. Well, the old Graslow farmhouse was built in 1813. For its first 125 years of existence, many farms sprawled across the lands of the Hudson Valley. Junction Ridge was primarily a farmer's town until demographics really changed in the 1960s. Farmers live and die by the weather. Some years are better than others. Droughts and bad weather are part of the reality of farming, but one year was particularly bad. In 1866, a severe drought and a scorching sun decimated crops all across the Hudson Valley of New York. Katy sighed as she had grown a bit impatient and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Fox. I appreciate the history lesson, but how relevant is a drought from over a century? How relevant is the weather to a supposed curse? That's what you want to know, isn't it?" Mr. Fox interjected before Katy could finish her sentence. Yes, actually," replied Katy as her big brown eyes grew wide. "Don't be surprised. Given the recent murder at the old Graslow farm, it doesn't take the deduction of Columbo to guess why you're here," said Mr. Fox as he straightened his glasses near his nose. "Oh, right. I suppose it was pretty obvious. Please continue," said Katy as she smiled slightly. Old man Mr. Fox continued. "So the drought was really, really bad in 1863. Some farmers lost everything and sold their farms for what they could. Almost all of the farmers did the best that they could, but chalked up the hardships as an act of God that was out of their control. Now, I said almost all of the farmers reacted with these sentiments, but not all of the farmers surrendered to this fate. Reginald Graslow refused to accept that events were out of his control. He wasn't going to let his livelihood and his property slip away from him. So, it's said that he took matters into his own hands. It's important to note that the practice of Spiritism and the occult skyrocketed during and after the Civil War. The inconceivable number of deaths impacted the psyche of the American people, and many of them opened what Christian society would have called forbidden doors. What forbidden doors did they open? What exactly did Reginald Graslow do? Amy asked as she sat up straight as a level. In a somber and serious tone, Mr. Fox replied, "Stories that have been passed down through the generations speak of the unspeakable. It is said that Reginald Graslow was skilled in dark magical arts. He was a practitioner of the old ways. On October 31st of 1863, Reginald performed a dark ceremony. He offered his 13-year-old son Wesley as a sacrifice to Demeter. To the ancient Greeks, Demeter was the goddess of agriculture. The innocent virgin blood of his own son had been spilled. Ever since that horrific night, records of strange deaths on the old Graslow farm have persisted through the years. There are a number of reports of a sinister scarecrow that stalks the fields. Just as sure as the arrival of the fall season, every autumn sees at least one person die on the old Graslow land. The lore says that the human sacrifice opened a door to a dark presence. The opening of this forbidden door acted as an invitation for a malevolent spirit to possess the Graslow property. Some believe that the possession is more specific. If there is truth to this, I happen to be of the opinion that it is not the land itself that's cursed. No, it's the infernal scarecrow that's cursed. It's diabolically possessed." The pretty faces of the two young women grew pale as Mr. Fox concluded his tale. Amy responded, "Wow, we have both seen the sinister scarecrow move and skulk around. I wasn't going to mention it to you because I know how crazy it sounds. In fact, until today I thought that I was losing my mind. So, Let's say this was real. Is there a way to end the curse? Is there a way to kill the Sinister Scarecrow and close the forbidden door? Rubbing his white bearded chin, Mr. Fox thoughtfully said, "Those are great questions, young lady. Hypothetically, one could perform a cleansing ritual and exorcise the malevolent entity from the Scarecrow. Then one would burn it, banish it, and send it back to its dark realm while closing the opened portal. This would help the person to reclaim and take ownership of everything on their rightful property." "Do you happen to have the spells or literature that gives detailed instructions to perform such a cleansing ritual?" asked Amy as her hazel eyes narrowed. "Why, yes, dear. I do have the manuscripts. However, it's too dangerous. I can't let you attempt this by yourself. Evil doesn't want to be forced out. It wants to keep acting upon whatever it's been given rights to. Malevolent inhuman spirits or demons will not quietly allow you to try to reclaim your rights over an object or a place. The history shows that this particular spirit is not only capable of killing, but that it does so again and again each year. It won't hesitate in attempting to kill you or anyone else that gets in its wicked way," Mr. Fox answered with a concerned look. "Okay, I understand that, and I appreciate your concern, Mr. Fox. I really do. But the thing is, I live in the old Grasslow farmhouse. The evil Scarecrow has been watching and stalking me. It already killed Eddie. Eddie was a sweet kid. He was my friend. If we don't do something, the killings will continue. If there is something that we can do, and we refuse to do it because we're afraid, then any future blood that's spilled by the Scarecrow will be on our hands," Amy responded in a determined voice. "Yes, child. You are right. At 73, I'm not a young man anymore, but I will help you. I'll come with you, and I'll help you to perform the cleansing ceremony. We will burn that rotten Scarecrow. We will put an end to this vile spiritual plague," said Mr. Fox with more conviction. So it was that Mr. Fox, Katy, Amy, and their friends Brian and Sam prepared for battle. Brian and Sam were with the girls partying in the field the fateful night that Eddie had been murdered. Eddie had returned to the Grasslow farm that night to play a prank on Amy's stepfather. He had wanted to get some payback for the insane threats made by Amy's stepfather. Unfortunately, that decision cost Eddie his life, because when he returned to the field, he was shredded to pieces by the evil killer Scarecrow. Late at night on All Hallows' Eve, the team went to Amy's house to put an end to the evil. They sought justice and closure. The old manuscript called for the ceremony to begin at the witching hour. It was to be completed as night became dawn on All Saints' Day, November 1st. It was a brisk, chilly autumn night. Rain from earlier in the evening had caused fog to develop and be trapped in the Hudson Valley. The light of the moon gave the fog an eerie glow. Nature seemed to have set the spooky atmosphere to match the ominous feeling felt by all. Things did not start according to plan. As the team arrived to the post where the cursed Scarecrow usually stood, they saw that it wasn't there. Their hearts began to beat more rapidly. The release of adrenaline heightened their senses. They were so alert that even the sighting of a cat prowling the night startled them. They were on edge, and with good reason. Mr. Fox began setting up an altar on a tree stump. As he did so, Amy, Katy, and Sam sprinkled holy water around the property. Brian investigated a sound that he had heard in the field. He was carrying a machete. The light of his flashlight did not provide much help because a denser fog seemed to be rolling in. The sound of the corn being slapped as though something was moving through it caused Brian's stomach to relocate to his chest. Fear settled in. Ready to strike, he raised his machete. Suddenly, the demonic Scarecrow appeared in front of him. Its yellowish red eyes glowed through its pumpkin head. Brian hacked the monstrosity's right arm off. The severed arm made of straw fell to the ground. After a brief moment, the severed arm launched from the ground and flew to Brian's neck. In disbelief, Brian gasped for air, but it was no use. The cursed arm made of straw choked the life out of him. With eyes burning, the Scarecrow looked on from only several feet away. Lifeless, Brian's body dropped to the ground. Amy, Katie, and Sam were concerned that they didn't know where Brian was. They began to search for him when Mr. Fox told them, "No, do not go looking for him. The Sinister Scarecrow wants to isolate us. Entering into that field in this fog will make that an easy task for him. We must remain here. We must stay together. We won't be able to kill this vile thing with ordinary weapons. We need to do the ritual. We need to follow the plan. Only when we get started and bless our weapons will they offer us any meaningful protection. Now, Amy, this is your home, and you have to be the celebrant of these sacred cleansing rites." Amy approached the altar. Enshrouded by the gloomy but slightly illuminated fog, she began to read the words of the ritual. As she did so, an unnatural and loud shriek was heard in the cornfield. The shriek was followed by the sound of something violently running through the field. The start of the ritual had not gone unnoticed. The Scarecrow grew furious. A glowing light began to encircle Amy, Katie, Sam, and Mr. Fox. Moments later, the wicked Scarecrow came running out of the cornfield and towards the group. The Scarecrow had picked up the machete that Brian had dropped as his dead body had fallen to the cold ground. The insidious monster raised the machete in its right hand. The very arm that Brian had severed had reattached itself to the hideous figure. The unholy straw man charged toward them, but it was propelled backwards. The glowing light surrounding this brave team had formed a protective barrier around them. The Scarecrow furiously thrust the blade against the magical force field. Again and again the Scarecrow slashed and hacked at the luminous perimeter, and again his attempts were thwarted. The ritual required hours of time, and the Scarecrow incessantly tried to break through the ring of protection the entire time. It shrieked a blood-curdling shriek again and again. It raged to and fro again and again. It tried to intimidate them. It tried to gain power over them by instilling and filling them with fear. These attempts proved to be futile. The brave team stayed united together. Amy refused to break her concentration. She would not, could not look beyond the necessary task at hand. Minutes before the break of dawn, Amy recited the words, "I reject and denounce evil. The past evil committed by others will not bind me. I am free. Evil is not welcome here. I bind the evil that was summoned here, so that it will do no further harm. The evil is bound, and it shall burn as the sun rises this morning. The light has revealed the evil. No longer can it hide in darkness. I take authority of my land. Light scatters the darkness. Let the light of the sun shine and destroy this unwelcome, vile spirit." The recitation of those words changed everything. Suddenly the Scarecrow, apparently compelled by an unseen force, flew up off of the ground and onto its pole. As it was invisibly bound to the pole, it shrieked. Only this time, the shriek sounded to be caused by pain rather than a pure anger. Then, as the sun rose, the Sinister Scarecrow burst into flames. The Scarecrow was never seen again. Amy's stepfather went to prison for the murder of Eddie. The evidence was overwhelming, and arguing that a cursed Scarecrow was the killer was not something that would hold up in court. Although Amy's stepfather was innocent in this case, he had in fact killed an ex-girlfriend of his years ago. No one had been able to prove it, but he was guilty. Seems like karma got to him. A lifetime sentence in prison ensured that he would never beat Amy again. With the help of Old Man Mr. Fox and her friends, Amy reclaimed her life. No longer does she walk in fear and darkness. The light shines her path. House of Ghosts. Cursed Dragon Rings. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. A house is supposed to be a safe place that shelters you from the evils of the outside world. It's supposed to be a warm home. Your house is supposed to be a dream come true and a place that gives birth to hope. However, not all houses provide these things. Some houses are where evil dwells. There are houses that crush hope and birth fear and despair. I know this to be true, because my dream home became a living nightmare that nearly shattered my soul. My name is Gabriel Burton. My lovely wife Linda and I moved from Westchester County in New York to Orange County. We moved with our kids to an old but beautiful and spacious house in the Hudson Valley. When our eldest boy, Stephen, became 13 years old, we knew it was time to buy a house. The apartment, which had served us well for the last decade, had become too cramped and cluttered for the four of us. Having a big yard for our two boys to play in was a dream that Linda and I aspired to make a reality. Looking at that big colonial-style house for the first time was a moment that we would never forget. It had been love at first sight. The charming house came with 3 acres of land. That was more than enough property for our boys, Stephen and Billy, to have fun on. The boys had been so excited. They wanted to move in at once. My wife Linda was also very excited. The 2-floor house had 5 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. One bathroom would be for Linda and I, and the other would be for the kids. While that may not seem exciting, it was for us, because the 4 of us had all shared one bathroom in our old apartment. Our first days in our very first house seemed like paradise. Our lifelong dream appeared to have finally come true. The 4 of us had been brimming with happiness. Things, however, are not always as they seem. The outward facade was quickly ripped asunder. The initial signs of trouble were overlooked or dismissed. Had you been in my place, you may have dismissed the little things too. After all, events started out small, and small things are easy to put aside. Shortly after moving into the house, objects would go missing or they'd end up in weird places. For instance, one time we couldn't find the TV remote. We looked high and low for it, but it was nowhere to be found. Then, a week later, I found the remote on top of the kitchen cabinets. Mind you, I needed a stepladder to reach the top of the kitchen cabinets, and I'm 6 feet tall. There was simply no way that my kids were going to reach it, not even if they climbed on top of a chair. The remote wasn't the only time that objects turned up in places that they shouldn't have. One time, Stephen had found some spices from the pantry in the top shelf of the closet in his bedroom. He was 13 years old at the time, so it's not like he was interested in the fine art of cooking. Yet, the spices had ended up in his closet. It was very peculiar. As strange as those instances were, my gorgeous wife had a far stranger experience. After a long day gardening, Linda had taken a relaxing shower. After working hard and sweating in the sweltering hot summer sun, there isn't anything as refreshing as a nice shower. After Linda had gotten out of the shower, she texted me to bring her a bra and slippers. She was certain that she had put her blue bra and her red house slippers in the bathroom. I had brought her a white bra and gray slippers because I had been unable to find the ones that she wanted. Later that evening, she found both her blue bra and her red house slippers in the most bizarre place. They were in the kitchen freezer. Odd as these instances were, we had been able to dismiss them as having been either a trick of the mind, a family prank, or a product of absent-mindedness. The misplaced items weren't the only unusual thing to occur. Alone in the house, I had heard the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone had been walking up on the second floor. After receiving no answer when I called out to see if Linda or the boys had somehow gotten upstairs without my knowing it, I went up to check it out. There was no one up there. On a number of occasions, Linda and the kids told me that they had heard the sound of someone walking upstairs when there wasn't anyone up there at all. Then there were the flushing toilets. Right after we moved in, we heard both the upstairs toilet and the downstairs toilet flush all by themselves. Although I wasn't a plumber by trade, I knew that toilets aren't supposed to flush themselves. The toilets seemed to flush regularly while we ate dinner together and after we had all gone to bed. Even after we had spent $1,000 on a plumber and a new toilet, the phantom flushing of the toilets continued. A bone-chilling cold would unexpectedly be felt at times within the house. Even on 95-degree days in August, I would suddenly feel a deep chill. After checking the thermostat, everything seemed to be normal. The temperature read 75 degrees. Those small peculiarities had soon turned into big fears. Our youngest son, Billy, began waking us up late at night. It seemed as though the awful sound of Billy's screams filled the house nearly every night between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. He told us that there was a bad man in his room. Night after night I checked the security alarm and walked around the house to make sure that there was no intruder. Time and time again there was no sign of trouble. Yet Billy kept pleading with us. He wanted us to help him. He insisted that a shadowy figure with a top hat visited his room every night. Linda and I chalked it up to nightmares. We believed that he was simply having night terrors. Billy was 10 years old at the time, and bad nightmares are not uncommon at that age. October arrived and we decorated the house for Halloween. Our family always looked forward to Halloween. We put up cute decorations. Linda and Billy loved the pumpkin, cat, ghost, and skeleton paper decorations that you tack into the walls. Stephen and I were more partial towards the scarier, adult kinds of Halloween props and animatronics, but we never had the space for them in the old apartment. Eager to finally be able to put up a life-sized Halloween prop, we bought one. We bought a 6-foot-tall undead butler. It had green skin. He wore a black suit with a black top hat. When activated by noise or motion, he would say, "Welcome. The Master has been expecting you. He will see you shortly." Stephen and I thought that the undead butler was totally awesome. The night that we put the undead butler up near the front door, we all heard him begin to talk as though he had been activated. The problem, however, was that we were all in bed. I got out of bed and unplugged him from the electrical outlet. This was the kind of prop that didn't run on batteries. It needed to be plugged into a wall outlet. I had gone back to bed. About 5 minutes later, my wife and I heard the heavy breathing sound that the undead butler prop makes, followed by, "The Master has been expecting you. He will see you shortly." The hair on the back of my neck rose as a chill ran down my spine. My wife and I looked at each other as she said, "I thought that you unplugged that thing." "I did unplug it," I replied as I jumped out of bed to see what was going on. Sure enough, the undead butler was unplugged. It wasn't possible for it to make a sound or turn on, and yet It had done exactly that. Linda and I heard it. We couldn't explain what we had just witnessed. That October had marked 5 months since we had moved into that house. It was also the month that saw a terrible escalation in frightful, ghostly activity. One evening, Stephen had been reading an e-book on his tablet in his room when he saw an old woman watching him from the rocking chair. She smirked right at him and then disappeared. A few nights later, Linda was brushing her teeth. After she rinsed her mouth and spit the water down into the sink, she raised her head and looked in the mirror. She saw the withered, pale face of a man staring back at her. She was so frightened that her body trembled and her voice was uneven an hour after it had happened. The unplugged animatronic undead butler continued to turn on and speak on a daily basis. Every day, the haunting footsteps, the phantom toilet flushes, and knocking on the walls were heard. There was no denying that something paranormal was going on. Linda, Stephen, little Billy and I were afraid. None of us ever wanted to be alone in that house. Something as simple as taking a shower had become an ominous quest. I felt like someone or something was always watching me. We never felt alone. We reached the point where we no longer felt safe. On October 13th, I had been outside watching little Billy play on the front steps. It was a partly cloudy and typically chilly fall day. Billy had been playing with his superhero toys. I smiled as I watched my son having a genuine moment of happiness and fun. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, I saw Billy fly up off of the front steps. It looked as though an incredibly powerful man had thrown him 10 yards into the air and into the old oak tree in the front yard. There was no one there. An invisible force had tossed him as if he was one of the toys that he had been playing with. The smile on my face vanished. My stomach sank like a boulder falling into a lake. My eyes grew wide as I felt an electric current run through me. I sprinted towards Billy to check on him. He had a bloody nose and a cut on his chin. After he stopped crying, it turned out that he didn't appear to have any broken bones. There were no indications of a concussion. Thankfully, he was all right. What happened to Billy had sent our anxiety through the roof. We were terrified. It had become clear that these evil spirits were capable of causing physical harm. Linda and I were very concerned for our boys. How could we keep our baby safe when we didn't even understand what was happening? How can you fight a ghost? I was also quite concerned for Linda's well-being. The time had come to call on some help. Linda and I scoured the internet to find someone that could assist us, or at least give us answers. After hours of searching, we found a local paranormal research group. They went by the name Hudson Valley Paranormal Troopers. We emailed them and explained the dire situation. They got back to us within an hour. They explained that because we had kids, they would get out here as soon as possible. 2 days later, Brad, the head of the Hudson Valley Paranormal Troopers, arrived. He had long brown hair parted down the middle. He also wore a mustache with a patch of hair under his bottom lip. He was about 5'10" tall. His t-shirt had Hudson Valley Paranormal Troopers written on it with a ghost for a logo. Brad explained that he had come by himself so that he could get the ball rolling. He told us what the paranormal troopers do and what we could expect from the process. Basically, they were going to set up sensitive equipment that might be able to record anything paranormal. Their methods were similar to what is seen on various ghost hunting shows on TV. After Brad interviewed us, he told us that he'd be back the next day with 2 other team members. Brad suggested that Linda, the kids, and I stay in a hotel or over a friend's house the day of the investigation. They had planned to stay in the house for 24 hours. We complied with the suggestion. We were happy to be spending a night outside of that nightmare house. Brad called me on my mobile phone the morning after the investigation concluded. He sounded stressed as he said, "Good morning, Gabriel. This is Brad from Hudson Valley Paranormal Troopers. The good news is that you guys aren't crazy. The bad news is that there is definitely something in your house, and it isn't friendly. We believe that your house is haunted by a malevolent entity or entities." I responded, "Thanks for the confirmation. We already knew that there was something wicked there. What can you do about it? What time do you want us to come back today?" "Well, Gabriel, this isn't something that we normally say, but frankly, we don't think you should come back here today. If you could stay in the hotel for a bit longer or stay with a relative, that would be wise," answered Brad in a serious tone. "Look, Brad, that's our house. We have been living there since June. Are a few more nights really going to make a difference? What if we send the kids to stay with my brother for a few days?" I asked with frustration. Brad calmly and with concern answered, "I know this is a lot to deal with. I would definitely make sure that your kids don't go back into that house unless or until it's cleared out. That place is extremely dangerous. Shelley, a team member, was thrown against the bedroom wall in your youngest son's room. She has a massive bruise on her back. Our camera caught the violent act. It also picked up the outline of a tall, shadowy figure dressed in what looked like an old top hat. In fact, the shadow figure resembled the animatronic Halloween prop that you have by the front door. We also recorded what seems to be a disembodied voice humming some old song. That's not all. 3 gold rings, each with the engraved image of a dragon, were discovered. Each had the word Malo engraved on it. Malo is Latin for evil. These rings were found in 3 separate areas. The first ring was found in the basement. The second ring was found in the crawl space in your bedroom. The third ring was found in the crawl space in your youngest son's room. In fact, Shelley was attacked shortly after she had taken the ring out of the crawl space in Billy's room. Overwhelmed by all of the information, I responded in a distant voice. "So, the tall shadow man with a top hat was real. The spirit attacked your team member in Billy's room. There are rings that have pictures of dragons and the word evil marked on them. What is going on? What does it mean? What can we do?" Brad calmly said, "You aren't alone. We are going to help you the best we can. You and your family really should stay out of this house for a while. We think that those dragon rings has something to do with the paranormal activity in your house. They might be cursed. We'll have to consult someone who is knowledgeable in spiritual warfare, demonology, and the occult. Please try to take a breath and hang in there. Saying some prayers wouldn't hurt either." I'll never forget how despondent I felt after that phone call. The conversation with Brad had left me speechless for several minutes. We were crushed by the realization that what we believed was our dream home was actually a home of nightmares. The hope that we once shared had morphed into dread. The joy that we initially had experienced transformed into deep sorrow. The former peace offered by the house had mutated into an unadulterated fear. Worst of all was the fact that Billy had been hurt in that house. Something unseen could have seriously hurt us. For all we knew, the evil demon could possess the ability to kill one of us. All of those thoughts and feelings nearly shattered my soul. The 4 of us went and stayed with my brother for a few weeks. I felt a mixture of relief and terrible anxiety. The relief was on account of being out of that cursed haunted house for a while, and knowing that my family was safe for the time being. The anxiety was due to the uncertainty about what was to come. If we couldn't get rid of the evil spirits, then we'd be forced to sell the house. If it came down to selling, how could I, in good conscience, sell that house to some other family? I couldn't put someone else in the terrible situation that we had found ourselves in. Yet, there was no way that we could continue to live there as long as it remained haunted by evil spirits. So it was that my mind was haunted by numerous thoughts and questions. The Hudson Valley paranormal troopers had consulted with a Catholic exorcist. This priest was an expert on demonology and the occult. The exorcist said that the engravings on the rings were of an occult nature. The dragon represented the devil. The rings were cursed. It seemed likely that a previous owner of our house had been a Satan worshipper. The priest suspected that a black mass that included a sacrifice, possibly a human sacrifice, was performed in the house. The dragon rings would have been consecrated to Lucifer during the black mass. The priest explained that such a dark ritual would have opened a gate to hell. A black mass and a satanic sacrifice performed on the property would have given demons rights to dwell and interact upon the property and anyone that crossed onto it. In his words, those evil deeds caused a demonic infestation of the house. In a demonic infestation, it is not uncommon to come across both demons as well as damned souls of humans. The exorcist further explained that the dragon rings acted as a dark insurance policy. That is to say, because they were consecrated to the devil and hidden in various locations throughout the house, they would ensure that the house remained diabolically infested, even if someone cleansed the house in more ordinary ways. A simple house blessing, or even having a holy mass offered in the house, wouldn't resolve the evil infestation. The cursed dragon rings had to be found, removed, and safely destroyed. The exorcist told us that he suspected that the paranormal troopers had only found half of the cursed dragon rings. Satanists revere the number 6. The significance of the number 6 led the priest to guess that 6 dragon rings had been hidden in the house. He suggested that the Hudson Valley paranormal troopers return to the house as soon as possible to locate the remaining 3 cursed dragon rings. He wanted to destroy the rings and offer a holy mass in the house on All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day is, of course, the day after Halloween. Since All Saints' Day is considered by Catholics to be one of the holiest days of the year, the exorcist was determined to cleanse the house then. That plan didn't leave the paranormal troopers much time to find the cursed dragon rings. Halloween was the next day, and that was the day that we went back to our haunted house in order to locate the cursed items. I went along with them. 9 a.m. was the time that we entered my house. The air in the house seemed to be extraordinarily heavy and oppressive. The presence of something unnatural pervaded the atmosphere. It was like an unseen beast was watching and stalking us. Fear permeated my pores. The undead butler Halloween prop greeted us by breathing heavily and saying, "Welcome. The Master has been expecting you. We will deal with you shortly. You will not survive." Footsteps could be heard walking across the upstairs floor just moments after we had walked into the house. Including myself, there were 4 of us. We split up into 2 pairs of 2 in order to cover more area. After 10 hours of searching, we had only found 1 more cursed ring. Brad had found it buried in the fireplace. Then, all of a sudden, we heard a loud, menacing moan. The bone-chilling moan was followed by the sound of glass shattering. Paul, the paranormal trooper that was paired with Shelley, had been pushed through the upstairs window. He had fallen to the ground and was badly injured. We immediately called 911 for help. That malicious attack ended our search that Halloween night. We obviously were not safe in that house, and the demons there were capable of gravely harming us, and they wanted us dead. If we couldn't find more than one dragon ring after 10 hours, then it wasn't likely that we would have any more luck had we stayed longer. No, it was more likely that staying longer would have resulted in death. The positive news was that Paul had some internal injuries and some external cuts, but he eventually healed. The negative news was that we failed to locate all 3 of the remaining dragon rings. We had only discovered one, and that meant that 2 cursed dragon rings likely remained in that house of ghosts. The exorcist did destroy the 4 cursed dragon rings that we had located, and he did offer a holy mass in our house. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to banish the evil spirits from the house. As soon as the priest finished offering mass, we heard an evil-sounding humming coming from upstairs. It was as though the evil spirits that dwelt there had been taunting us. The exorcist said that it wasn't safe there, and that it probably wouldn't be safe there unless the remaining 2 rings were found and destroyed. He said that he would contact a spiritually sensitive person in the hope that she might be able to locate the rings. We thanked him for his help, but we were certain that we were leaving that house. It was too dangerous. We would never feel safe there again. So, we put the Hell House on the market. The realtor laughed at us when we told her that the house was haunted and very dangerous. It sold 2 months later. We offered the same warning to the buyer. He mocked us for the warning at the time, but a year later he put the house on the market. As far as I know, the House of Ghosts remains infested with evil, and the cursed dragon rings remain hidden. Do you like ghost stories? Better yet, do you like true ghost stories? If the answer is yes, then join me as I tell another scary story from the haunted Half Moon Inn. Together, we will travel to the frightening land of the supernatural. We're going to a place where it appears as though cracks in the fabric of reality allow otherworldly beings into our world. This episode is about the real experiences that my friends and I shared when we worked at a movie theater back in the late 90s. We believed that the theater was haunted. Some of the names and places will be changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The events will be recalled as accurately as possible. These are our stories. The Haunted Movie Theater, a true ghost story. As the 20th century was drawing to a close, strange paranormal events showed no signs that they would cease on account of the rapid advances of science and technology. Ghost stories appear to have been with us since the dawn of man. Perhaps tales of ghostly apparitions and spooky spirits will remain with us for as long as we walk this amazing space rock that we call Earth. Do you think that spirits only haunt ancient castles and old homes? Do you feel safe from ghostly hauntings when you're in busy public establishments such as libraries, restaurants, and movie theaters? If so, then this particular true story may make you reconsider. Around 1997, I worked at a Cineplex in the Galleria Mall. Along with my friends and many of my co-workers, I believed that the movie theater was haunted. In the late 90s, it was common for the supervisors in the theater to work multiple roles, including supervising the concession stand, the box office, operating the projection booth, and the floor crew, which cleaned theaters. Jared Batsy Batsvelka, a supervisor, was working as the projectionist one day. His friends called him Batsy on account of his last name, not because he was batty in any way. Working in the projection booth was a very different experience than working the other jobs at the theater. Whereas all of the other positions required working in the very hectic conditions created by the sea of customers that swept through the theater in tsunami-like waves. Working in the projection booth was like working in an island of calm. However, all was not always as it seemed. Alone in the projection booth with the door locked, Jared felt as though someone was about to walk by him. Instinctively, even knowing that there was no one up in the booth with him, he looked to see who was about to pass by him. Just a few feet away from him, he saw the faint image of a man. The man appeared as though he was half in this material world and half in another world. It was something like the image of a grainy, low-definition video that is lacking all of the pixels to create the clear, full image. This low-pixel man appeared to be dressed as a construction worker. After only a few seconds, the ethereal figure vanished. It was as though the pixels on the fabric of our visible reality had simply been deleted. Batsy had similar experiences on a number of occasions. He'd seen the ghostly figure of the construction worker in the projection booth, as well as near the popcorn popping room, which was just outside of the booth. Batsy never felt an evil or negative vibe from this ghost. For this reason, he never feared him. In fact, he would occasionally say, "Hello," and ask this ghostly man how he was doing, but he never received a reply. Carlos, another supervisor, also told the story of his ghostly encounters in the theater. On one occasion, Carlos was working as the projectionist. Alone in the booth, a man yelled and complained to him about the sound being too loud in Theater 5. After complaining, the man, dressed like a construction worker, walked out and disappeared. Carlos saw that the door had been locked, and when he ran down the hallway and then down the stairs, he only found a second locked door. He had been alone, yet he had just interacted with someone that shouldn't or couldn't have been there. On several other occasions while performing theater and aisle checks, Carlos had seen the same man sitting by himself in Theater Room 5, or sometimes in Theater 6. Theaters 5 and 6 were the last theaters on the first floor, near the emergency exits. On those occasions, the man dressed as a construction worker would suddenly disappear. While the apparitions of the ghost weren't witnessed by all of the theater staff, there was an experience that was far more common. I, along with a number of my coworkers, noted that theater rooms 5 and 6 were unusually cold in comparison to the other theater rooms. When popular movies brought in masses of people in sold-out shows, it was standard for those theaters to be very warm. The body heat generated by the large audience routinely raised the room temperature to less than comfortable levels. Theaters 5 and 6 were the exception to this rule. They were often unexplainably cold. Several of my friends also had a vibe or a feeling that they weren't alone when they went into Theaters 5 and 6 by themselves, or when they were alone in the back of the projection booth. Theaters 5 and 6 would trigger my fight or flight senses whenever I had to clean them by myself on slow weekdays. Being alone in those theaters put all of my senses on high alert, and my heart would subsequently beat just a little bit faster. The cold, dark, and dirty empty theaters, coupled with the stories of the ghost that haunted them, cultivated a touch of dread. Despite my hesitation of being alone in those theaters, I had to go in them, because it was my duty to clean them out before the audience came in for the next showtime. The atmosphere when cleaning those theaters by myself was just as chilling as when I was alone in the projection booth. In fact, the atmosphere in the projection booth and near Theaters 5 and 6 reminded me of the atmosphere of my dad's old haunted farmhouse. Both places had a heavy and unnatural feeling, but I have to add that the old farmhouse was in a league of its own, as its atmosphere was far heavier, much more sinister, and filled with dread. Unnatural, chilly, and thick are the words that best describe the sense of the atmosphere in and near Theaters 5 and 6. While I personally never saw the apparition of the ghost of the Galleria movie theater, I did come to believe that it was haunted. My belief that it was haunted by a ghost was largely based on the stories that my friends and co-workers shared with each other, and on the presence that I felt there. When I worked as one of the supervisors at the theater, I did everything that I could to avoid working as the projectionist in the original projection booth. While I didn't get the sense that the ghost was evil or some kind of malevolent entity, I was very uncomfortable when I was alone in the projection booth. Can you blame me? Just because I didn't think that the ghost was sinister and looking to harm me didn't mean that my impression was correct. If the place was haunted by a being that I couldn't see, then how could I know when it was around or what it was doing? Without being able to know with certainty who or what it was, how could I know that it wasn't like the evil spirits that haunted my dad's old farmhouse? The staff of the movie theater frequently talked about the apparent haunting. We theorized that the ghost of a construction worker haunted our home away from home at the theater. It wasn't much of a leap to arrive at that conclusion. After all, the local newspaper had reported that a construction worker died in a tragic accident while the Galleria shopping mall was being constructed in the early 1990s. The sightings of the ghostly apparition dressed in the attire of a construction worker near Theaters 5 and 6 seemed to neatly mesh with the record of a construction worker falling to his untimely death at that very spot. Perhaps the scariest of all the haunted movie theater stories is this final one. Jeremy was working as the projectionist in the projection booth. Jeremy was a big muscular guy. He was known to be tough, and his punch hit like a mule kick. His random punches to the arms and bodies of male employees were notorious. When he hit you, it hurt. Sometimes the film would snap while a movie was running, and the projectionist would have to make the necessary repairs as quickly as possible. This in and of itself was a normal occurrence for any projectionist in any theater. What wasn't normal or ordinary is what followed next. As Jeremy put the repaired film back in place on the projector, he felt a sudden cold chill accompanied by the feeling of an unseen presence. He was alone in the projection booth, and the door was locked. The movie film that broke was the movie reel that was playing in Theater 6. A firm finger poked Jeremy's shoulder hard. His blood ran cold. He whipped his head around, and he saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was no one else there. He was alone. After that haunting experience with the theater ghost, Jeremy refused to be the projectionist in the upper booth. He'd only run projection in the lower booth, in the newer theaters on the basement floor. The lower theaters were completely separated from the haunted booth in the original 9 theaters on the ground level floor. I recently spoke with a few of my old friends and former co-workers, including my manager from my days working at the movie theater. They told me that they still believe that it really was, and probably still is, haunted. So, next time that you are at the movies, take a look around you and see who's sitting next to you. Does anyone around you look like they are a few pixels short of a full high-definition image? Does the man or lady sitting behind you appear to be fading from reality? The theater might be hosting both the living and the dead. It could be a ghost that's sitting with you. My chilling beach trip to a haunted hotel. Have you ever felt a bone-chilling cold on a bitterly hot day? I have. I was frozen in the sweltering summer heat. It was the kind of heat wave that's not suitable for man nor beast. Simply standing outside for even 5 minutes could cause you to sweat through your short-sleeve shirt. The humidity that pumped in from the sea flooded the air. It was brutally oppressive. Yet I had been frozen in place. An unnatural chill crashed down my spine like a cresting wave crashes on the beach. I felt a unique kind of fear. It was the type of feeling of fear that you remember for the rest of your life. I wouldn't have believed it if it hadn't happened to me. It all began when we went on a vacation to the beach. My name is Kevin Jones, and this is my ghost story. I was 17 years old that summer. My parents were taking me and my younger sister Hannah on vacation. We normally went to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for our annual summer vacation, but this year was different. Mist of the Sea Beach in South Carolina was where we were headed. Summer vacations were a highlight of our year. We didn't have lots of money, so we only went on vacation once a year, and the trips lasted only about 3 to 5 days. Those glorious days of summertime fun were sealed into my memory. It's amazing how so short a period of time can stand out so much more than the seemingly endless monotony of day-to-day life. Mist of the Sea Beach was much smaller and less known than Myrtle Beach. My parents said that it would offer a quieter and less crowded experience. We lived in the Midlands of South Carolina, so any trip to the beach was always welcome. Unlike the Midlands, the low country of South Carolina offered a nice sea breeze, which made the humidity much more bearable. The beach there was beautiful. The sand was similar to the sand elsewhere along the Carolina shore, but the ocean seemed different. Perhaps it was because there were far fewer beachgoers, or perhaps it was because of the shape of the shoreline. Whatever the reason, the ocean somehow seemed to be more intimate. As massive and as majestic as the sea is, here it seemed as if it was just you and it. It was just you and the endless bluish-gray water that reached further than the eye could see. This beach rested in peace between Charleston, South Carolina, and Tybee Island, which was near Savannah, Georgia. The seclusion gave the impression that you were somehow stepping back in time. It seemed like a time in which everything moved slower, and humans hadn't yet developed and commercialized the beach into a theme park. Isolated as the Mist of the Sea Beach was, I had the sense that I wasn't alone. In fact, it wasn't long till each of us had a sense that we were never alone there. After spending our first day at the beach, we went inside our hotel room so that we could each take showers before we went out for dinner. My sister was going to be the first to take a shower, but we all took turns using the bathroom before she did. Isn't it something how swimming in the water makes you feel like you have to go pee? I used the bathroom first, and as I was washing my hands, I thought that I saw a person quickly walk into the shower. I saw it from the corner of my eye, so I didn't see any definitive shape. It was more of a shadow that quickly moved. As soon as I had seen it, it disappeared. I opened the door to the shower and saw nothing. No one was there. I dismissed it, thinking that it was nothing more than a product of spending hours in the bright sunlight and then suddenly going into a sunless room. The eyes needed time to adjust to the different lighting, I said to myself. After my sister Hannah had been in the shower for 20 minutes or so, she stormed out of the bathroom and said, "Kevin, not funny, you stupid jerk-face!" "What in the world are you talking about? Why are you so mad at me?" I replied as I waved my hands. "Why am I mad? Don't play dumb, doofus," Hannah answered while pointing her finger at me as if it was a loaded gun. Raising my eyebrows, I responded, "Look here, sis. I have no idea what you're on about." "Mom, tell that jerk to apologize to me. What he did isn't cool, and it's not funny." I'm almost 16 now, and I want privacy," said Hannah with ever-widening eyes. "Honey, please calm down and tell us what you are so upset about," said our mother in an even tone. "Ugh, I could just scream. He plays dumb and nobody does anything about what he did," said Hannah as her voice seemed to rise along with her hands as she lifted them over her head. "Honey, I know you're upset, but I think that you are upset about something that your brother didn't do," our mom responded after making a short sigh. "You always take Kevin's side. It's not fair," Hannah exclaimed as her face became increasingly more red. "Hannah, that's enough. I'm not taking sides. Kevin couldn't have done anything because he's been right here talking to us the whole time you were in the shower," our mother explained with a sterner tone. "Come with me and take a look. Tell me then, who did this?" Hannah demanded. We walked into the bathroom, and written on the steam-covered mirror were the words, "Beware, beware, beware." It certainly was creepy, but I hadn't done it. Like Mom said, we were all talking to each other while Hannah showered. Dad, Mom, and I never left sight of one another in the time period in question. This caused my sister to believe that I played a prank on her, and we believed that she was messing with us. It wouldn't have been the first time that a family member played a practical joke on another. Although Hannah remained very annoyed, we all went out to the captain's kitchen for dinner. Later that night, after feasting upon delicious seafood, we returned to our oceanfront hotel room, stuffed, content, and exhausted from a long day of sun and fun at the beach. We headed to bed. There were 2 queen-sized beds in our room. Mom and Dad shared one, and Sis and I shared the other. She slept under the sheets, and I slept above the sheets on my side of the bed. Under different circumstances, we would have protested the arrangement, but we understood that we didn't have the money to book 2 bedrooms. Being as tired as we were, we didn't have the energy to complain anyway. All that mattered was that we were at the beach. Vacations to the ocean were the best. Around 11 o'clock was when we had all gone to bed. Later that night, I had awakened from a dream about a beautiful young woman. In the dream, the woman appeared to have been staying in this hotel. Her clothing and her hair looked like the style that was popular in the 1960s. I watched her walk over to the balcony as she gazed at the ocean with a look of gloomy despair. When I woke up, the feeling of deep melancholy from the dream remained with me. Along with this acute sadness was a cold chill. Goosebumps rose on my arms and legs. Fear began to rise through me like the sea rises during high tide. As this was going on, I became aware of an unshakable feeling that our family wasn't alone in our room. "No, no, no! Help me! Somebody help me! Somebody please help me! I'm drowning!" Hannah screamed as she woke up from a terrifying nightmare. At that very moment, we saw a pretty but very pale young woman staring right at us. She was floating 1 foot off of the floor in front of our beds. She was wearing a white bikini with some kind of white robe-like covering that was open in the front. The fact that she was floating above the floor wasn't the only unnatural part about her appearance. She also seemed ethereal or vaguely mist-like. The ghostly specter stared at us, and its mouth seemed to be screaming. Yet not only did no words come out, but neither did any sound proceed from her lips. Highly agitated, this ghostly girl turned around and walked through the door. When I say that she walked through the door, I mean she literally walked through the door. She went right through the closed door like light shines through glass. Silence reverberated around the room as we remained motionless in our beds for a short time. Time felt like it had slowed down to a crawl. What was probably a few moments, or maybe a minute or two, seemed like an eternity. It turned out that all four of us saw the ghostly girl. The spirit looked exactly like the beautiful young lady from my dream. The only difference was that the ghost was pale and partially transparent. My sister explained that she had awakened screaming from a terrifying nightmare. She had dreamt that she was swimming in the ocean when a strong current had pulled her down the shore as it grew stronger and stronger until it plunged her beneath the surface. Her lungs filled with water. It burned as it felt as though the water hugged her so tightly that she couldn't breathe. No one had heard her screams, and she was powerless in the arms of the might of an angry sea. She explained that it had been the most vivid and realer than real nightmare she had ever had. The four of us didn't get any additional sleep that night. We talked about what had happened. We discussed different explanations for what had happened. Dad wondered if the four of us could have hallucinated on account of some bad food. I jokingly dismissed his suggestion by calling him Ebenezer Scrooge. Eventually we agreed that ghosts must be real, and we had just seen one for the first time. Creeping fear remained with us throughout the night. The night that we were visited by a ghost was a night that none of us would ever forget. Strangely enough, the story doesn't end there. Just because you may be done with the dead doesn't mean that the dead are done with you. After an early breakfast at a lovely restaurant, we ventured back to our room. We were there just long enough to change into our swimsuits and to get all of our beach accessories for the day. Not one of us wanted to stay in that room any longer than was strictly necessary. Once we got to the beach, we forgot the extraordinary and chilling events of the night before. It was as though the sun had melted all of our troubles away. Now it was time for sunbathing, walking along the shore, and swimming in the ocean. We were having the time of our lives. The day was hot, humid, sunny, and beautiful. An ocean breeze gave little comfort, but that was okay, because we had the refreshing 83-degree Atlantic Ocean to cool us down. The waves were considerably calmer than they were the previous day. Mom and Dad had gone for a walk down the shoreline. They loved walking down the shore, where the ocean waves became a gentle trickle on the sand. That place where dry sand meets water-laden sand always seemed magical to us. It was as though the ocean was alive, and it wants to wake the sleeping sand up to play. Wearing my blue swim trunks, I laid on my back to soak up some sun. With my eyes closed, the light of the sun still seemed to break through my eyelids in a way that caused me to imagine all kinds of wonderful things. It seemed as though the sun had the power to awaken my imagination. The heat of the sun enveloped me like a warm blanket. Absolutely exhausted from the night before, I fell asleep. Suddenly, I woke up from a deep sleep. Someone had poked me to wake me up. I looked around, but there was no one there. Turning my head, I scanned around to see where my parents and my sister were. No luck. I didn't see them. An icy cold chill went through me. That's when I saw it. The mist-like beautiful girl from my dreams was standing at the shoreline pointing towards the sea. There was a girl who was struggling in the water. There were no lifeguards there. My parents weren't there. There was hardly anyone on the beach at all. The distressed girl was wearing a red bikini. My sister had been wearing a red bikini. Then it hit me. That was my sister. My sister was thrashing in the water. Dear God, it looked like she was about to drown. Racing into the ocean, my heart beat rapidly like machine gun fire. I dove in the water like a seal and swam towards Hannah as fast as I could. My freestyle strokes pounded the water like the enemy that it now was. Channeling my anger and fear, I conquered the distance between us. Hannah had gone beneath the surface of the water shortly before I had reached her. I dove down and grasped her, pulling her up with all of my strength. The rip current was exceptionally strong. I could hear my father's voice in my head as I remembered what he had taught me. Son, listen to me. This is important. It could save a life. If you ever get caught in a rip current in the ocean, it's a really bad idea to try to swim against it. No matter how scary it might seem when the current gets its grip on you, never, ever try to overpower it and swim against it. Instead, swim with the current and follow it as it parallels the beach. That advice saved our lives that day. I held Hannah as we swam parallel to the shore until the angry sea loosed its indescribably powerful grip on us. With the rip current gone, we finally swam to shore and collapsed on the dry, soft sand. After several minutes, I began to make snow angels, or rather, sand angels in the sand, because I was so relieved and joyful now that my sister and I were safely ashore. The angel that day came in the form of a beautiful girl who happened to have been a ghost. A ghost saved my sister's life. When my parents, my sister, and I returned to the hotel, we asked some employees if this hotel was haunted. The hotel staff explained to us that not only did the hotel have a reputation for being haunted, but so did Mist of the Sea Beach. In 1969, a young couple came to the hotel that we were staying in for their honeymoon. The pretty young woman was 19 years old. The young wife shared the same first name as my sister. Her name was Hannah Stone. On a hot, beautiful summer day in July, she went into the ocean to cool off, while her husband fell asleep on the beach. The ocean seemed unusually calm that day. Waves were absent. The surface of the sea appeared as flat as a sheet of glass. So Hannah went into the sea without any concern. Appearances can be deceiving, though. Tragically, that was the case on that fateful day. The rip current caught a hold of Hannah, and it took her under. She drowned that day. Some of the residents of Mist of the Sea Beach say that Hannah was so beautiful that the lonely ocean wanted to keep her for itself. The hotel employees also told us that guests had reported experiences and sightings of Hannah over the years. Such reports seem to be more common when there is a powerful riptide along the shores of Mist of the Sea Beach. The spirit of Hannah lives on at Mist of the Sea Beach. Thanks to Hannah, my sister lives on in the flesh. Next time you go to the beach, remember Hannah, and remember my story. And always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there. The Dark Rider, Murder by Proxy. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. He followed the hooded figure into the foggy forest. It was night. Light posts appeared as sentinels watching over the trail. Under ordinary conditions, these lights provided more than adequate illumination of the trail. This night, however, was different. The light caused the thick fog to glow, but it failed to provide visibility. Visibility was noticeably worse than it would have been walking on a lightless path without fog. At least under those conditions, the half-moon would have provided sufficient light. As things were, the water droplets within the fog had caused the light from both the moon and the lampposts to refract and create a murky veil. It was an ominous sight, almost an unearthly atmosphere. Carlos watched as the man in the hood deftly ran alongside the fog-shrouded trail. On several instances, the man suddenly stopped. Then he'd tilt his head back and swivel it side to side. Next, he'd spontaneously sprint further ahead. His movements seemed inhuman. The mannerisms were reminiscent of a dog tracking an animal in the wilderness. It was as though the man in the hood could see and move perfectly in the dark fog-covered woods. A barred owl called out into the night. "Hoo hoo choo-hoo!" It sounded as if the mysterious creature of the night was asking, "Who cooks for you?" Around 10 seconds later, another owl responded with the same vocalization. The pair of owls continued to call to each other as the distance between them grew shorter each time. An eerie howling wind along with barred owl calls were the only sound in the woods. The man in the hood remained silent as he swiftly sprinted towards some unseen target. The strangeness of the man's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Carlos and the owls keenly watched the mysterious man in the hoodie as he stalked the misty night. It was as though the owls themselves sensed something sinister, unnatural, and perhaps supernatural. Carlos was in a state of mind that was confused, concerned, and fearful. His reasoning was not right. His mind was as foggy as the evening landscape which surrounded him. He had always possessed a sharp mind. Critical thinking was a skill that his friends and family had always admired in him. Perceiving subtle details of people, places, and events was something that he always excelled at. On this night, things were different. His mind was jumbled. He felt as though he had been heavily intoxicated, but he hadn't had any drinks, nor had he taken any drugs. When he tried to think about any detail, the thought would fade away. It was as if his thoughts were like smoke that couldn't be grasped. The thoughts would repeatedly slip through his hands. A memory, or rather a partial memory, returned to Carlos. The image of him closing up Java Nirvana, the coffee cafe that he owned, came to his mind. He saw images of the cafe, him locking up the door, and rain falling down on his car. Next, he saw a pretty young woman as feelings of anger and fear swirled throughout his being. Then he saw an altercation with the young woman. The image of a pale-looking girl lunging at him briefly popped into his head. The memories and images vanished just as quickly as they had appeared out of thin air. When he tried to focus on any particular image, it would dissipate. The harder he tried to focus on a memory, the sooner it would vanish. Again and again he tried to remember, but again and again it was of no use. He grew increasingly frustrated. It faded away just like dreams fade away upon waking up from a sleep. He wondered whether or not the images and memories were from a dream, or even if he was currently dreaming. All of his memories were fractured and disjointed, just as is the case with dreams. Nothing made sense. A dream-like fog had settled into his mind, and he questioned what was real and what was not real. Wrestling with this madness, Carlos continued to follow the hooded figure through the foggy forest. He couldn't recall why he had to follow the man in the hood, but he simply knew that he had to. Something in the core of his very being demanded that he track the man. The barred owls continued to hoot in the night. The man in the hoodie had run to a tree and stopped dead in his tracks. Crouching down behind an old oak tree, he could have been mistaken for a statue of a gargoyle. The thick blanket of fog made the crouching hooded figure look like a sentinel of a Gothic castle. Like a banshee, The disturbing man appeared to be a harbinger of death. A teenage boy appeared. He was walking his beloved mutt. He was only 20 yards away from the disturbing man in the hood. The boy was walking right towards him. The man was downwind from them. Had he been upwind of them, the trusty dog likely would have picked up his scent. Carlo shouted, "Boy, look out! Run back now!" The boy continued to walk further forward. Suddenly, the crouching figure lunged at the boy. With great violence, the man had knocked the boy to the forest floor. The dog growled and then attacked the attacker. Though the dog had drawn blood, the attacker swatted him away like a fly. The 60-pound dog had been tossed over 20 yards away. The boy's furry friend smacked into a tree. He was knocked out. The man in the hood pinned the teenage boy's arms to the leaf-littered floor with great ease. Though the boy was 16 years old and a varsity football player, he couldn't budge his attacker's grip. It was as though his attacker had the strength of 10 men. Carlos tried to pull the man in the hood off of the boy, but it was of no use. He couldn't get a grip on him. He pulled back his right leg and coiled it, before punting the man's head. Horrified, Carlos watched as his right foot passed harmlessly through the man's head. Carlos was stunned. He didn't understand how it was possible. He hadn't missed the mark. He was right on target, but the blow passed through the man. As the man pulled back his head, Carlos saw him clearly. Carlos's jaw dropped to the ground as he staggered backwards. What he saw was impossible. Yet he saw it, and he couldn't unsee it. The face he saw staring back at him was his own. The man in the hood was his mirror image. Bewildered, Carlos stared silently for what felt like an eternity. The man in the hood opened his mouth wide. 2 sharp fangs extended from the pale-faced man's upper jaw. Next, like a serpent, he struck the boy's throat with a vicious bite. Blood spurted out of the boy's neck as it gushed into the creature's mouth. Some of the blood splattered onto the leaf-covered ground. The man was a vampire. In a frenzy, he greedily gulped up the warm, life-giving blood of the handsome teenager. Carlos snapped out of it and yelled, "Stop it! Stop it! Get off of him, you monster!" There was no response. Carlos again tried to stop the beast. He cocked his right hand and launched a big roundhouse right to the vampire's jaw. Once again, his hand had passed harmlessly straight through the vampire. Not only hadn't he been able to strike the undead creature, but he hadn't even been able to feel any physical sensation at all. Confounded and desperate, he looked for a large stick or a rock to use as a weapon. He saw a large stick, but when he went to pick it up, his hand passed right through it. Raucous, monkey-like howling sounds filled the foggy forest. It was the sound of a pair of barred owls getting ready to mate. It seemed as though the vampire bloodlust had excited the nocturnal, predatory owls. Helpless horror and pure despair flooded his soul. Carlos was watching himself as his own body attacked a teenage boy. His mouth had torn open the boy's jugular, and his lips sucked the life out of an innocent kid. He was watching a murder, and he was the murderer. He wondered if he was possessed, or if he was having some kind of psychotic break. He was in a nightmare, and it was a nightmare that he wouldn't wake up from. This was a living nightmare. Carlos couldn't make sense of any of this. How could he be a killer? How was it that he could watch himself as though he was watching a movie? If he was a killer, How in the world did he get to be so strong? How did he have fangs? Why was he drinking innocent human blood? Was he a vampire? Those were the insane questions that Carlos pondered until the boy was dead. Once the boy had been killed, Carlos feverishly looked on as a partly translucent shape rose out of the corpse. The shape looked like the boy, but it was ethereal. It was the ghost of the young man. The boy's spirit squinted his eyes and stumbled around confusedly. Then the boy looked at Carlos and said, "You! What did you do to me?" Carlos answered, "That wasn't me. I'm so sorry. I tried to help you." The spirit of the boy then faded away. Carlos observed that the ghost faded in and out for several minutes. Each time the boy appeared, he seemed confused. He didn't seem to know that he was dead. That's when it all suddenly came back to Carlos. He finally remembered it all. He had left work the previous night, just as he always had, when a strange woman approached him in the parking lot. The dark-haired, pale-skinned young woman smiled at him as she walked closer toward him. He had noted that while she was very attractive, she also had a wild look about her. She seemed to be both sexy and dangerous. Something inside of him sensed an unnatural presence. It was as though he was simultaneously drawn to and repulsed by her. The seductive woman was about 25 yards away from Carlos when he curled his lips, gave a half-smile, and quickly opened the door of his car. Within an instant, she was upon him as she slammed the door of his car shut. He was startled. He realized that there was no way that a human could cover so many yards so fast. Even if such a speed were possible to achieve, why would she have sprinted toward him to slam his door closed and to pin him up against his car? Fear rushed through his body. He knew something was very wrong. The mysterious white-fleshed woman, less than an inch from his face, stared at him. She looked at him like she wanted to devour him. Right as he was about to say something, she lunged at his neck and bit him. He felt a terrible sting as her teeth pierced his flesh. Carlos struggled to escape her clutches, but he failed. She was stronger than anyone he had ever met. Even though she couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds soaking wet, she had a machine-like grip. She possessed an inhuman strength. He was also discovering that she possessed an inhuman, insatiable hunger. She rapidly guzzled his hot blood as an athlete guzzles iced tea after a hard workout. The world began to spin as he grew ever more lightheaded. A fog fell across his mind as he found it nearly impossible to think. His legs felt like they weighed 500 pounds. Weaker and weaker, his body was unable to support itself. Only the vice-like grip of the vampire kept him upright against his silver car. As his consciousness faded further away, the incredible weight that he had felt throughout his body transitioned into an indescribable weightlessness. So much blood had been taken from him, and it caused him to feel as though he was floating in outer space. As his heartbeat slowed, his life flashed before his eyes. He had accepted that he was about to die. He accepted that he would never fall in love again, get married, have children, or expand his coffee shop into a successful franchise. He knew that he would never look into his old high school sweetheart's eyes again and tell her that he still loves her. When he was finally at death's door, the vampire slit her wrist and forced her blood into his mouth. Carlos wanted to resist, but he was so weak that he couldn't raise up more than a whimper in his defense. The vile vampire made him swallow her cursed blood. Her infernal blood tasted smoky and bitter. She had completely violated and dominated him. Several minutes after the accursed blood went down his throat, he began to convulse. In agonizing death throes, his body writhed on the dirty ground. Then he exhaled one final breath in the form of a terrible death rattle. He was dead. The infernal blood of the vampire had finished him off. Many believe that death always ends suffering once and for all. Those who think that way are mistaken. Sometimes a suffering so terrible that words can't adequately describe it ensues after death. Sometimes death isn't the end. Sometimes death is only the beginning of an unfathomable suffering and the birth of a soul-crushing pain. This horrible death is the kind of death to which Carlos had been delivered. After he had been mercilessly killed by a powerful preternatural creature, his soul departed from his body. No dazzling white light awaited him. No beautiful tunnel appeared. There was no comforting presence coming to soothe his aching soul. What waited for him instead was a nightmarish fog of confusion. As his spirit alternated between fading into and then out of the earthly plane, so too did his memories come and go. At first, he realized that he was dead, but that realization soon vanished. Dead and separated from his body, he watched as the female vampire went inside of his car and broke his windshield from the inside out. Next, she flung his car into a tree. She then picked up a sharp shard of glass and used it to slash his throat. This post-mortem mutilation hid the fang marks. Emergency responders might well come to think that a car accident had caused the loss of so much blood. The evil vampire proceeded to dump Carlos's corpse onto the edge of the lake that bordered Java Nirvana. Next, with great sorrow, Carlos watched as the emergency responders pulled his lifeless body from the edge of the lake and transported it to the morgue. He remained with his corpse, but he continued to fade into and out of our existence. Then, the night after his murder, he looked on in horror as a shadowy, inhuman spirit manifested itself in the morgue. The shadow being had the basic shape of a man's body, but had a grotesque dragon's head. It was the most frightening sight that he had ever seen. Though Carlos no longer had a body, he felt a bitter cold. The ghastly horror escalated. The inhuman spirit entered the deceased body. Carlos watched helplessly as his dead body rose up from the cold slab in the morgue. The skin looked like dirty snow. His reanimated corpse began to walk. The undead body found a locker, broke it open, and stole a gray hoodie and black jeans. Carlos was speechless as he saw his corpse dress itself in the stolen clothes. Carlos followed his walking corpse out of the morgue. Though his memory shattered as he had faded into and out of the earthly realm numerous times, he retained a singular focus. He knew that he had to follow his dead and hijacked body. Even when he had forgotten that he had been killed and that some kind of demon was possessing his body, he retained the compulsion to follow the man in the hoodie. When all of these memories came back to Carlos all at once, it was like a tsunami. Forgotten images and feelings made him drop to the ground as he held his head in his hands. Since he no longer had a physical body, he wondered if his reaction was a force of habit. Pain, guilt, remorse, fear, and a profound loneliness raged through his suffering soul. Watching his corpse kill a young man had brought all of his memories back. Carlos now understood that his body belonged to a vampire. The only body that he had ever had was now possessed by forces of darkness. There was nothing that he could do about it. He couldn't even punch the vampire. As far as he knew, he couldn't pick up any objects or influence the physical world at all. Nevertheless, he was determined to continue following his stolen corpse. He wasn't going to give up yet. More pain awaited him. Of that he was certain. The torment of watching yourself maul and extinguish the life of another is indescribable. It was all so surreal. This was the worst nightmare that he had ever had, and he was living it. Or perhaps, given the circumstances, it's more proper to say that he was dying it. Vampire Carlos was on the move again. The real Carlos felt an awful despair when he realized where the fiend was headed. They were only a few houses away from his former high school sweetheart. This monster was going to visit his first love. Although they weren't a couple anymore, they remained friends through the years. She didn't know it, but in the secret chamber of his heart, he never stopped loving her. A white-hot anger rose like a furious fire in his soul. The rage was amplified by the deepest sadness and despair that he had ever known. Sure, he had felt these emotions as Vampire Carlos killed the boy, but now it was magnified. The thought of his dear friend meeting the same horrendous, unnatural death was unbearable. With each step he took toward fate, the sorrow, rage, and despair grew in magnitude. When the real Carlos focused on his first love and her house, he suddenly found himself there. He had spontaneously transported his spirit into her house. Astonished that he had traveled at the speed of thought, the eyes of his spirit grew wide. There was no time to consider the awesomeness of what he had just done. He knew that the evil, undead imposter was only minutes or perhaps moments away. He had seen how quickly vampires could move when they so desired. "Lydia, it's me! I'm right here!" Carlos shouted. Though Lydia was standing only a foot away from him, she didn't hear him and she couldn't see him. Growing frustrated, Carlos shouted, "It's not him! He's not who he seems to be! Don't trust him!" Carlos repeated those words as a mantra. They became a desperate prayer. As he recited those words time and time again, an unexpected thing happened. The rage, sorrow, and despair had been swallowed up by a new feeling. It was love. Yes, a pure, deep, and sweet feeling of love had enveloped his soul. He could feel a great power in this love. A knock on the door caused him to feel like a deer caught in headlights. It was the murderous vampire. Lydia pulled out her phone to check the video from her security camera. She opened the app to see the footage as the voice at the door said, "Lydia, it's me, Carlos. Something terrible happened. I need to talk to you. Let me in." She put her phone down on the end table without looking at it. The footage showed something of crucial importance. The security footage revealed an empty porch. No one appeared in the video. Had the vampire not spoken to her through the front door when he did, she would have been alerted to the danger. Her silky black hair bounced as she walked toward the door. Lydia opened the door and said, "Carlos, come on in. What's wrong?" The vampire walked through the door. The ghost of Carlos felt love surge through his spirit again as he said, "Lydia, he is a vampire. That is not Carlos." Lydia squinted her beautiful eyes, glanced to her left, and smoothly slid her hand under a shelf near the door. The vampire had passed her and was now several feet into her house. He turned around and smiled. He flashed his fangs and then said, "Lydia Marsh, the fearless FBI vampire hunter, your time is up. The Master sends his regards." The vampire threw himself toward her. With his hands extended, he looked like a demon flying through the air. As his hands began to grab her, a sharp wooden stake pierced his ribcage and went into his heart. His body immediately exploded into thousands of tiny bits and pieces. The spirit of the real Carlos had succeeded in getting his message to Lydia. She had heard his thoughts in her mind. It sounded like the voice of Carlos, but it sounded even more authentic and clear. It was some kind of mental telepathy, and it probably saved her life. After she got the mental message, she slowly and stealthily put her hand around one of the various wooden stakes that she had hidden around the house. Special Agent Lydia Marsh was still suffering the nasty effects of the concussion that she had received by the hands of the Master. The Batcave incident had left her and Agent Castabello wounded, and neither had been cleared to return to duty. The Master was now hunting them instead of merely toying with them. She called Adam Gabriel and Annabelle and asked them to come over her house, but to be very careful. She told them that the game had changed, and that they were now the hunted. After Lydia hung up the phone, she began to cry. With the assault thwarted, her adrenaline dissipated. She finally had time to process what had just taken place. Her old high school sweetheart, her first love, had turned into a blood-sucking monster and tried to kill her. She then killed him, and his accursed undead corpse exploded all over her house. That's more than anyone should ever have to process. She cried as she realized what it meant. It meant that her first love and her good friend Carlos had been killed by a vampire. It also meant that he had been turned into a vampire. Lydia wasn't sure what happened to the souls of people who were turned. She didn't know if Carlos was at peace, or if he had lost his soul to the foul beast that had turned him. As terrible as those things were to consider, there was something that really weighed on her conscience. The message that the vampire relayed made clear that Carlos wasn't simply an unlucky victim in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, it was obvious that the Master had chosen Carlos. He knew that Carlos was close to Lydia, and that she trusted him and cared for him. Carlos was a pawn in the Master's diabolical game. She couldn't help but think that the horrific fate of Carlos was her fault. Had she not been a vampire hunter and a member of the Moon Mist Division, then Carlos would still be alive. As she sat and stared at the gruesome remains of her ex-boyfriend, she sobbed uncontrollably. She recalled the time that Carlos asked her out. Then she thought about their first kiss, the times they'd walked together at night, the laughs that they shared, and the real love that they had felt for one another. The spirit of Carlos watched her and sat beside her. She couldn't see it or feel it, but he placed his hand in hers. A knock on the door was followed by Annabelle saying, "Hey girl, we're here and we ain't no vamps." Lydia opened the door and let her teammates in. Adam and Annabelle gasped when they saw the gruesome scene. It wasn't that they hadn't seen the disgusting mess left behind by vampires that had been destroyed, but they were surprised to see it in Lydia's home. No team member had been attacked in this way before. Lydia filled them in on the nerve-wracking events. Annabelle gently placed her hand in Lydia's hand, held it, and said, "Lydia, sweetie, it's okay. Do you feel that? It's Carlos. He's holding your hand right now. He loves you and he wants to console you." Lydia wiped tears from her eyes and replied, "Yeah, that's a nice sentiment, but I'll never know where he is. No one can know. He's gone." Annabelle smiled and squeezed Lydia's hand and responded, "He isn't gone. I can assure you that he is right here because I'm looking at him. He is trying to hold your hand. He's been sitting right beside you since we got here." Lydia's eyes widened as she said, "You really can see him? You can see ghosts?" "Yes, hon, I really can see Carlos. He's a handsome soul. I can see spirits sometimes. Usually I can only see them if they want to be seen. In this case, your sweet friend really wants to be seen and heard," answered Annabelle. Lydia smiled and told everyone how special Carlos was. Annabelle relayed the story that Carlos had told her. He described everything in great detail. Lydia again began to sob after she heard the terrible story. Annabelle put her arms around her friend and said, "Remember that none of this is your fault. Carlos now knows the kind of work that you really do for the FBI. He doesn't blame you at all. He is amazed at how strong you are and how much light you bring to the world." Lydia replied, "Yeah, but I put a stake through his heart. I literally drove a stake through his rib cage." Annabelle looked into Lydia's eyes and said, "You put a stake through the undead heart of a monster. That wasn't Carlos anymore. An evil, inhuman spirit that never lived in a physical body possessed his corpse. That's how these kinds of vampires operate. Some willingly surrender their wills and souls to serve the master, and then he turns them. In other cases, these vampires force their accursed blood into the mouths of their dying victims. When no consent is given, the mortal dies. The soul is separated from its rightful body. Then, on the following night, a dark rider comes. The Dark Rider enters the accursed body, which has been resurrected by vampire blood." Lydia sniffled and questioned, "The Dark Rider? So Carlos wasn't inside of that thing? He wasn't a prisoner of the evil blood?" Annabelle continued to explain. "No, dearie, Carlos wasn't inside of the vampire. However, his soul was bound to its former body, in a manner of speaking. When a dark rider takes over the vampire body, the original inhabitant of the bodily vessel is tethered to the stolen body. The soul walks in sorrow and distress unless or until the vampire is destroyed and the body is finally put to rest. The soul basically becomes a passenger that is destined to walk the earth and see the carnage caused by a dark rider who uses the person's very own body to unleash terror. Carlos didn't kill anyone, but he was helpless to stop the dark rider. All he could do was watch. The murder of the young teenager earlier tonight was a murder by proxy. Had you not driven a stake through the vampire's heart, Carlos would have been destined to experience a never-ending nightmare. You expelled the Dark Rider from its host. You have saved Carlos from unimaginable pain. After we give Carlos a proper burial, he'll be able to move on and find true peace." Lydia cried once more, but this time the tears were tears of joy. Trick or Treat, Stalked on Halloween. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. Halloween was always very special to me. Along with Christmas, Halloween was a day in which anything seemed possible. It was a day when the extraordinary became ordinary. Even the dull monotony of going to school was transformed into something fun and exciting. Classrooms and hallways were eerily decorated with paper decorations of witches, black cats, pumpkins, skeletons, and ghosts. You, along with all of your friends and classmates, were dressed up in costumes that you wouldn't have been permitted to wear on any other day. Amazingly, in the spirit of Halloween, many of the teachers dressed up in costumes too. Candy was shared in classrooms, and a spooky school Halloween parade was held. It was truly magical. As fantastical as Halloween always was, one particular Halloween was the most fantastical of all. The year was 1991. I was 12 years old and in the 7th grade at the time. October 31st fell on a Thursday that fateful year. A cold rain in the morning had departed, and left behind a ghostly fog, which had enveloped the entire Hudson Valley. The spectral mist surrounded the fantastic fall foliage. The leaves, with their various shades of orange and red, seemed to have shined through the fog as though they radiated a soft light. Simply put, the landscape looked as though a spooky cartoon depiction of Halloween had sprung to life. My parents had said that I could take my little sister, Haley, out trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. Pedro, my best friend, came along with us. It was the first time that we had gone trick-or-treating without our parents. The taste of independence, or so we thought, would surely make the candy more delicious. I chose to be a vampire for Halloween. My dad, who was dressed as an undead ghoul, had put on my makeup for me. Dad and I loved horror movies, and we particularly loved vampire movies. Fright Night, The Lost Boys, and Salem's Lot were our favorite vampire flicks. He did a terrific job of making me look like the vampire from Nosferatu. With Dad's help, I looked delightfully dreadful. Haley had chosen to be a witch for Halloween. Mom had gotten her a costume from the store, and she applied her green makeup for her. Haley wore the classical black conical witch's hat along with a black dress. She carried a plastic orange pumpkin to put all of her treats in. She was so excited that day. She almost loved Halloween as much as I did. The elementary school's Halloween parade earlier that day had really lit the fire of Haley's anticipation. She had won Best Halloween Short Story in her 4th grade class. The Grim Reaper is what Pedro had chosen to be for that Halloween. He was dressed in a homemade black robe with a hood. Pedro's mother had lovingly sewed his costume for him. The details of his robe were far superior to anything available in the store. The macabre robe even had a skull and crossbones on the chest. The backside was adorned with a half moon and the words, "Fear the Reaper." Sunset was at 5:53 p.m. Pedro, Haley, and I left my house to go trick-or-treating at 5:30. We wanted to be out walking the neighborhood as the sun set. Dusk was the perfect time to begin our Halloween adventure. There's something magical about being outside as day transforms to night. That sense of something magical is only increased on Halloween. On Halloween, we got the chance to be the monsters. If we were the monsters, then we had nothing to fear. Or at least, in our innocence, that's what we had thought. The eerie fog covered the streets of Junction Ridge. As the sun went down, the fog began to take an unsettling and unnatural appearance. Our neighborhood in Junction Ridge had always gotten into the Halloween spirit. Most of the houses put up Halloween decorations in their front yards. The orange Halloween lights from these home haunts had given the fog an unearthly glow. The fog, the orange lights, and the life-sized monster props created an ominous atmosphere. Each person's yard was like a scary scene from another world. Similarly, each door that opened after you knocked on it was a glimpse into the home and lives of the people who lived there. How amazing it was to wonder what their lives were like. The imagination ran wild as you considered what similarities and differences might exist between their families and yours. Today's trunk-or-treating can't compete with good old-fashioned trick-or-treating. The truly bizarre events of that night began shortly after sunset. It started as the three of us had heard a distant voice calling out, "Hey, hey, Haley." This ghostly call haunted us for the remainder of our time trick-or-treating. The voice calling out my sister's name seemed to come about every 20 minutes or so. It wasn't a voice that we recognized, and it seemed otherworldly in some way. It was like hearing a broken up or a faded voice on a long-distance call. If that wasn't creepy enough, we heard a wolf howling in the distance. It made us very unnerved. We became more unnerved as we became aware that a man was following us. The man was tall and thin, seemingly unnaturally thin. He wore a red robe with a red hood. His creepy outfit was accentuated by his realistic skeleton mask. To make light of the potential threat that we perceived he might pose, we nicknamed him Old Thinny. He was accompanied by what appeared to be a wolf. I knew that it couldn't have been a wolf, so I assumed that it must have been a husky. At around 6:30 p.m. we had lost sight of him. As I stood still, I turned my head around like it was on a swivel to see if I could locate Old Thinny. I was pushed to the ground by Gary Bormat. Gary was the school bully. He mercilessly bullied Pedro and I. He also hadn't been the sharpest tack in the box. He was only in 7th grade with us because he failed 7th grade the previous year. "What's your problem? Why don't you leave us alone?" asked Pedro as he extended his hand to help me up from the ground. "You want to know what my problem is? I'll tell you. My problem is that you and your friend Johnny are dorks. I hate dorks, and I hate you," replied Gary coldly. "Hey, Gary, just leave us alone," I said. "Aw, baby Johnny wants us to leave him alone," Gary said in a whiny voice as his two overgrown cohorts emerged from the fog. Gary's friend Jack handed him a baseball bat. With a sick smile on his face, Gary took the steel baseball bat, ran towards a nearby jack-o'-lantern on someone's yard display, and he struck it with the bat. The jack-o'-lantern was shattered. Gary's other barbarian of a friend, Simon, laughed like a madman. The bullies weren't dressed up for Halloween. They wore their ordinary, everyday clothes. "Leave us alone, you jerks! If you don't leave us alone, my big brother is going to make you regret it," Haley threatened. "Your brother Johnny is a loser. All three of you are pathetic losers. Johnny is even more of a little girl than you are, you ugly little brat," said Gary as he stepped closer. "Yeah, Johnny and Pedro are real girly men. Only girly men dress up for Halloween," sneered Jack and Simon. Fearless, Haley slapped Gary across his acne-covered face. Gary's brutish face became blood red as he pushed Haley to the ground. He was about to get on top of her, but I tackled him to the ground and punched him right in his face. Blood began to flow from his nose. White-hot adrenaline had flooded my body, and I had acted on pure instinct and rage. Before I could hit Gary a second time, 4 hands pulled me off of him. Gary's cohorts, Jack and Simon, had stepped in to save Gary from being humiliated further. As Jack restrained me, Simon punched me in the gut. Pedro came to my aid and punched Simon's jaw. Gary had retrieved the bat and blindsided Pedro by swinging away at his back. Pedro went crashing down to the ground face first. Swinging the bat wildly through the air, Gary walked toward me. He had become unhinged as he threatened. "You're dead! You're all dead! I'm going to kill you all!" Suddenly, Jack screamed in terror. Each of us turned to see that he was being dragged backward into the fog. A red-robed figure was effortlessly dragging Jack away. The fog obscured what happened next. Jack's screams grew more distant, and then they ceased. Each of us stopped dead in our tracks. The silence was deafening. Before we could process what was happening, the silhouette of a tall and extremely thin figure in a hooded red robe slowly approached us. As the figure came closer, I saw that it wore a lifelike skeleton mask. It was Old Thinny. Gary, with baseball bat in hand, began to walk towards Old Thinny. Simon, always the mindless follower, followed. Frozen by wonder and fear, Pedro, Haley, and I looked on. As old Thinny drew closer, it became clear that his feet weren't touching the ground. His feet were about 6 inches above the ground. He was floating. In fact, he was floating directly towards our attackers. Gary stopped. He must have seen that this mysterious red-hooded figure was floating toward him. Old Thinny continued to slowly and menacingly float toward the remaining bullies. Gary yelled, "I don't know what you are, but you're gonna pay for this!" Old Thinny responded, "You're right about one thing. You don't know what I am. Your puny mind can't even imagine who and what I am. But you're wrong about the other thing. It's you who's going to pay." "Whatever, bonehead. We're not afraid of you," replied Gary as if he was trying to convince himself. "You should be. Indeed, you should be very afraid of me," said Old Thinny as he raised his right arm and pointed at Gary. In doing so, it was revealed that the hooded figure wasn't wearing a costume. He was truly a skeleton. Simon's face grew paler than a ghost. He turned and ran away. Right before our very eyes, Old Thinny had morphed into a horrific, demonic-looking clown. He took out a chain and lassoed Simon. The grotesque clown reeled Simon in like a fish. The sound of the rattling chain whipping through the air added to the already sky-high levels of fear. After the ferocious clown pulled Simon in, it grasped him with its claw-like hands. Then it pulled its head back and opened its mouth until it was 2 feet wide. A light began to leave from Simon's mouth, and it entered into the grotesque clown's mouth. This must have continued over several minutes. When the transfer of light or energy was complete, Simon's lifeless body dropped to the floor like a sack of potatoes. His skin had turned white as snow, and his body had shriveled. Haley cried. Mouths agape, Pedro and I watched the gruesome scene as though we had been frozen in time. It had been the sound of Haley's crying that snapped me out of the trance-like state. I shook Pedro, grappled Haley's delicate little hand, and yelled, "Run!" The 3 of us ran like the wind. As we were running, we noticed that Old Thinny was never out of sight. He wasn't moving, and yet, no matter how fast or how far we ran, we didn't create any distance between us and that monster. It was as though the fog truly was otherworldly. The orange-tinted, glowing fog had acted as a magical barrier. After 5 minutes of sprinting around, we fell to our knees. I saw Gary repeatedly strike the clown-like creature with his bat, but it had no effect. After his arms grew tired, he dropped the baseball bat. Exhausted, he said, "Who are you, and what do you want with me?" The hideous clown stared at Gary and answered, "I have numerous names. I am Fear. I am Dread. I am the bringer of death. I am the swallower of souls. I am Halloween. As to what I want with you, it's the same as I wanted from your moronic cohorts. Respect and fear is what I desire. Each Halloween I move over the earth searching for disrespectful fools such as yourself. You and your disrespectful friends do not have the Halloween spirit. You did not honor this most magnificent and special day. Not only did you not wear a costume or decorate your homes, but you had the audacity to mock those who did honor the Halloween spirit. The penalty for your crimes is death. Not only will I kill you, but I'll swallow your soul too. Your soul will belong to me, and I'll take you to my world where you'll eternally be my slave. Oh, and one more thing. I have a special surprise for you. I know how much you like werewolves." As the ghoulish figure completed those words, he transformed into a great, big, and ferocious werewolf. The clothes that the clown had been wearing tore apart, and hair grew out of its skin. The body remained similar to the shape of a man, but its head got longer and became wolf-like. The snout was long. Its eyes were glowing yellow, and its teeth were large and sharp. It was as if the teeth of a T-Rex had replaced the smaller teeth of the clown-like figure. Gary peed in his pants as his body shook all over. The werewolf lunged at Gary, grabbed him by his throat with his right hand, and lifted him several feet off of the ground. The werewolf unhinged its jaws, and the light of Gary's soul began draining into the creature's mouth. The creature sucked in the light until the light was gone. After it had finished feeding, it dropped Gary's corpse to the ground like it was garbage. The disturbing creature then returned to the frightful shape of a skeleton wearing a red hooded robe. It once again looked like Old Thinny. He levitated about half of a foot off of the ground and began floating toward us. As he hovered closer, closer, ever closer, he hummed a song that you might expect the organ to be playing in Dracula's castle. We tried to run, but it was of no use. The mystical fog had mysteriously imprisoned us. My blood had already run cold. Each moment felt like an eternity had passed. I felt powerless to protect my sister or my friend. Fear consumed my being. Just when I thought that it was impossible to be more afraid, the fear increased even more. This fiendish ghoul, Old Thinny, came within a yard of us. He looked right at me and said, "Boy, do I have a Halloween treat for you." Old Thinny then morphed into a vampire. He looked like the classical version of the vampire in Nosferatu. Grayish flesh grew over his bones. He had 2 red glowing eyes. His fingers and fingernails were long. 2 sharp, pointy fangs protruded from his mouth over his lips. It was absolutely terrifying. The ghastly thing then looked at me with its glowing red eyes and said, "This one's for you, kid. I know that vampires are your favorite. Everyone is entitled to a scare on Halloween. I'm quite sure that you'll never forget this splendid night, nor will you ever watch a vampire film the same way again. This is my dark gift to you." Simon's greatest fear was a clown, so I assumed the form that would frighten him the most. For Gary, I became a werewolf, because that was his worst nightmare. As a bonus, their souls taste so delicious when they're terrified. Old Thinny then bent down and took Haley's hand. My skin crawled as my stomach churned with crippling anxiety. Old Thinny lifted my sister's soft hand to his lips and he kissed it. After he gently kissed her hand, he said, "Sweet little girl, you have a gift. Your short horror stories are splendidly horrific. We will be watching your writing career with great anticipation." Standing up straight, Old Thinny looked at all 3 of us as he said, "The 3 of you are blessed with a strong Halloween spirit. Very few people respect, enjoy, and honor this most wonderful day as you do. The spirit of spookiness is strong with you. Don't ever change." The 3 of us felt the greatest relief that we had ever felt when we realized that he wasn't going to harm us. Old Thinny then returned to his red hooded skeleton form and floated into the fog. He called for his furry companion. A wolf howled and then came running to his side. The wolf had glowing orange eyes. With his wolf at his side, Old Thinny floated away. Just before he disappeared into the ethereal orange-tinted fog, he turned back and said, "Happy Halloween." So it was that we would never forget that Halloween on Thursday in 1991. We were stalked while trick-or-treating, and I believe that the ghoulish stalker saved our lives. If you ever think that you are too old for Halloween, remember Old Thinny. If you disrespect or desecrate Halloween, the ghostly spirit of Halloween might just pay you a terrifying visit. The Halloween that you decide to mock or attack those who love the holiday might well be your last. Always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there. I hope that you enjoyed your stay here at the Haunted Half Moon Inn. The Master requests that you consider supporting me and the inn by becoming a patron of mine on Patreon. The Half Moon Inn needs your support to keep the doors open. You wouldn't want the residents here to feel forgotten and abandoned, would you? Creating quality scary stories to share with you is very important to me. Running this inn of horror is a passion of mine, and I would truly appreciate your support. The world is hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, with your help, we could haunt this world one home at a time. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.